The US of A is the serial killer capital of the world. From an Alaskan who hunted humans for sport to the killer clown from Illinois that murdered dozens. But who was the worst killer from each state? And which state had the worst killer of all? Number 50, Wyoming. Population 580,000. Homicide rate 2.6 per 100,000 people. Wyoming has the lowest population in the United States, but that doesn't mean it has the fewest serial killers. With 32 cases over nearly 30 years, it's also home to one of the creepiest, Rodney Alcala, aka the dating game killer. Yes, he appeared on a TV show in the middle of the killing spree. Alcala murdered at least 9 people and maybe as many as 130. His thing? Strangling victims, letting them come to, and then doing it all over again. Talk about a nightmare date. Number 49, Vermont. Population 650,000. Homicide rate 3.4. Vermont may be famous for its peaceful vibes, but it also had Gary Lee Schaefer. Between 1979 and 1983, he kidnapped and murdered 3 young girls. He lured them into his car, did horrific things, and left their bodies behind. Vermont's got its dark side too. Number 48, North Dakota. Population 780,000. Homicide rate 3.5. North Dakota doesn't have a huge serial killer history, but it's where we find Eugene Butler, the Great Plains Butcher. Back in the 1900s, Butler killed 6 men and buried their bodies under his house. His crimes weren't discovered until years after he died in an insane asylum. Number 47, South Dakota. Population 920,000. Homicide rate 6.9. Congratulations, South Dakota, you got the lowest number of serial killers in the entire country, with just 10 recorded between 1992 and 2019. The odds of running into a serial killer here are super low, but that didn't stop Robert Leroy Anderson, also known as the duct tape killer, from making headlines in the mid-90s. Anderson, being the total creep he was, kidnapped and tortured 2 women before ending their lives. He was sentenced to death but never made it to the execution. He was found dead in his cell before they could carry it out. Number 46, Delaware. Population 1,030,000. Homicide rate 7. Delaware's claim to serial killer infamy is Stephen Brian Pennell, the Route 40 killer. Between 1987 and 1988, Pennell picked up women along Route 40, tortured them in his car, and beat them to death with a hammer. He was executed in 1992. Number 45, Rhode Island. Population 1.1 million. Homicide rate 2. The smallest state in the US gave us 25 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and one incredibly unique killer, Craig Price, a man who claimed 4 lives while only a teenager back in the 1980s, making him the youngest serial killer in American history. But that didn't stop him from being one of the most brutal. One victim, 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer, was stabbed 58 times in her own home. He was only 13 years old. Price stabbed 39-year-old Joan Heaton 57 times in front of her 2 young daughters, whom he also murdered. He was only 15 when this happened. His attack was so frenzied that the blade broke off and was lodged in the 10-year-old girl's throat. Number 44, Montana. Population 1.15 million. Homicide rate 5.4. Here we see the numbers start to climb again. 47 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. The state's most infamous killer is Wayne Nathan Nance, aka the Missoula Mauler, who was posthumously connected to at least 6 different murder cases from 1974 to 1986. Nance often liked to invade the homes of his victims, immobilizing them and tormenting them for his own gratification before shooting them to death. However, he'd get a taste of his own medicine in the end. When he tried to murder his bosses, Doug and Kristen Wells, they were able to turn the tables on their would-be killer and murdered him instead. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Next up is something really rare, a female serial killer. Number 43, Maine. Population 1.4 million. Homicide rate 2.6. Despite being the land of Stephen King, Maine only had 35 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But if you head back to the bloody decade of 1884 to 1894, you'd find Mary Cowan, the Borgia of Maine, and her 6 unfortunate victims, all of them her immediate family members. She poisoned 2 of her husbands and 4 of her children before eventually being caught while trying to murder her 3rd husband. And you thought the dating game today was tough. Now let's take a look at one of the freakiest looking killers on our list. Number 42, New Hampshire. Population 1.4 million. Homicide rate 1.8. Despite only having a mercifully meager 14 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, New Hampshire gave us serial fraudster and murderer Terry Peter Rasmussen, also known as the Chameleon Killer. believed to have claimed over 5 victims on his killing spree from 1978 to 2002. Like Mary Cowan, many of his victims were lovers or his own child, who were tormented and murdered under one of Terry's countless aliases. His chameleonic nature allowed him to get away with his crimes for decades, and when push came to shove, they were only ever able to convict him of one of what were likely many killings. But our next killer was never convicted at all. Number 41. Hawaii. Population 1.45 million. Homicide rate 3. The beautiful land of Hawaii had only 13 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But from 1985 to 1986, it also acted as the hunting ground for the Honolulu Strangler, an unidentified serial killer who murdered as many as 5 people. And you thought Mark Zuckerberg was the worst person in Hawaii. As the moniker suggests, the killer attacked his victims, bound them, abused them, and strangled them, often leaving their bodies with their hands tied behind their backs, and in one case wrapped in a tarp. For all we know, he could still be out there somewhere today. Now let's take a look at another terrifying female killer. Number 40. West Virginia. Population 1.77 million. Homicide rate 6.2. While these country roads may take you home to West Virginia, with 43 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, you might not leave alive, especially if you ran into Retta Mays, a classic angel of death serial killer who likely murdered over 8 elderly military veterans in 2017 and 2018. While working as a nursing assistant, she intentionally gave fatal doses of insulin to her patients. She was also obsessed with other female killers, searching them online and watching Netflix documentaries about other killer nurses. Who knows if an aspiring killer is watching this video right now? But there is a far more prolific monster on the way. Number 39. Idaho. Population 1.9 million. Homicide rate 2.7. Idaho's number of serial murders is roughly on par with West Virginia, with 45 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. One strange case is Thomas Eugene Creech, a killer who has been convicted of 5 murders, but has claimed as many as 42. The big question is, what is the truth? Creech claims to be a contract killer, to have committed murders for biker gangs, and to even have committed human sacrifices for satanic cults. The problem is, it's very likely that Creech is telling tall tales to pass the time in jail. Truth is, we may never know. The crimes of our next killer, however, are all too real. Number 38. Nebraska. Population 2 million. Homicide rate 3.7. Two things are true about Nebraska: there is plenty of corn, and there were 82 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But the most infamous murder technically isn't a serial killer, he's a spree killer, and his crimes are so well known that they made it into Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire." Charles Starkweather took the lives of 11 victims during his killing spree from November 1957 to January 1958, aged 19 years old and accompanied by his 14-year-old girlfriend. Anyone who ran into them had a good chance of meeting their doom at the business end of Starkweather's Winchester Model 1906, his Stevens Model 59A, or his .38 revolver. But this next killer's crimes will truly turn your stomach. Number 37. New Mexico. Population 2.1 million. Homicide rate 14.5. Despite what you might have seen on Breaking Bad, New Mexico had only 72 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But it also had one killer that makes Walter White look like Mr. Rogers: David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer, who was suspected to have murdered anywhere from 60 to 100 victims. But it's what he did to his victims before he killed them that makes David Parker Ray so monstrous. He tortured his victims in his own personal toy box, a cargo trailer he allegedly spent $100,000 on converting into a high-tech torture chamber, designed specifically to live out his most twisted and sadistic fantasies on his captives, including things we literally cannot describe here. He also eluded justice in the end, dying abruptly of a heart attack before he could be properly interrogated. The less we say about this one, the better. Number 36. Mississippi. Population 2.9 million. Homicide rate 20.7. This state had 98 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and also gave us the despicable Donald Leroy Evans, a remorseless predator who preyed on the young and vulnerable in parks and rest areas, claiming anywhere from 3 to over 70 victims in total. Violent crime would also be the end of Evans' life, after he was arrested and convicted when fellow prisoner Jimmy Mack stabbed him to death during a prison altercation. Live by the knife, die by the knife. But Evans looks downright chill compared to our next killer. Number 35. Kansas. Population 2.9 million. Homicide rate 5.8. Dorothy Gale's home state is responsible for 181 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and also one of the most twisted, murderous masterminds in American criminal history, Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, his self-given nickname standing for Bind, Torture, Kill. Yeah, he's an edgy one. BTK murdered at least 12 people, with 2 more suspected, living up to his namesake with brutal home invasions that he pulled off with intimate knowledge of his victims' security systems. He even taunted the police about his murderous escapades, getting caught when he flew too close to the sun, and his correspondences led right back to him. Would you believe our next killer is even worse? Number 34. Arkansas. Population 3.1 million. Homicide rate 11.8. We're starting to see statewide murders climb, as Arkansas had 143 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. One particularly gruesome killer was Ronald Gene Simmons, not to be confused with the frontman of Kiss, a mass murderer who annihilated his entire family and several others, totaling 16 victims, over the course of 1 week in 1987. Simmons was a monster before he snapped and went on his killing spree, having long carried a campaign of abuse against his family. He shot, drowned, and strangled all of his victims, achieving the dubious honor of being Arkansas's most prolific killer and the perpetrator of its worst mass shooting. Number 33. Nevada. Population 3.2 million. Homicide rate 7.8. This arid state is mainly known for gambling, aliens, and organized crime, so it's unsurprising that there were 117 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. It was also home to Carol Cole, a low-life killer believed to have claimed anywhere from 5 to 30 victims from 1947 to 1980. Somehow flying under the radar all that time, he destroyed life after life. Murder was in Cole's blood. He even committed his first killing at 8 years old, drowning another boy in Richmond, California. Number 32. Iowa. Population 3.2 million. Homicide rate 2.9. Iowa is one of the safer states where murder is concerned, with only 53 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But back in 1961 and 62, the unfortunately named Gano Smith was wiping out his own family one by one until he racked up 6 murders to his name. But while Gano kept it in the family, our next killer went on the hunt. Number 31. Utah. Population 3.4 million. Homicide rate 2.2. A state known for its natural beauty and desert landscapes, was also the site of 86 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. One of the most violent and cruel killers in the state's history was Arthur Gary Bishop, responsible for the murders of 5 young boys for his own gratification. After a long history of predatory behavior toward boys, Bishop graduated to murder in 1979 when he lured young children to his apartment with false promises of free candy, money, or games, where the boys were tormented, mutilated, beaten with hammers, and drowned in the bathtub. And our next killer was even more prolific and methodical. Number 30. Connecticut. Population 3.6 million. Homicide rate 4.3. Connecticut isn't just known for its colonial history. It also had 134 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. Among its bevy of killers was Michael Bruce Ross, also known as the Roadside Strangler, and the Eggman, responsible for murdering at least 8 women from 1981 to 1984. He was a ruthless killer who gained deep personal pleasure from his crimes. He was caught and eventually put to death by lethal injection, a verdict that he himself supported, despite being a critic of the death penalty. His most famous moniker, the Roadside Strangler, didn't actually come from the time of his crimes. It was given to him by a British documentary about serial killers in 1995. But his numbers pale in comparison to our next killer. Number 29. Oklahoma. Population 4.1 million. Homicide rate 8.3. The stats once again jump with Oklahoma, 200 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. No slouch in pumping up the numbers was one Roger Dale Stafford, a vicious killer who claimed between 9 and 34 lives during his killing spree from 1974 to 1978. Stafford murdered the Lawrence family and 6 employees at a steak restaurant during a botched robbery. Though he never acknowledged guilt, he was connected to many other murders before his execution by lethal injection in 1995. But Stafford's bloodthirstiness was nothing compared to the cruelty of our next killer. Number 28. Oregon. Population 4.2 million. Homicide rate 5.1. Oregon is a beautiful state to visit, despite playing host to 175 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. One of its most infamous was Jerome Jerry Brudos, known alternatively as the Lust Killer and the Shoe Fetish Slayer. Care to hazard a guess as to why? Brutus abducted and killed 4 people across 1968 and 1969, strangling his victims in either his car, basement, or garage, after which he would dismember most of his victims, in some cases keeping the feet as souvenirs for later. Yes, that's why he was the Shoe Fetish Slayer. Now, how about a killer who is truly prolific? Number 27, Kentucky. Population 4.5 million. Homicide rate 8.3. The proud state of Kentucky can boast 212 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and one of its most prolific killers was a hospital orderly, Donald Harvey, another classic angel of death, who ended the lives of anywhere from 37 to 87 people. He started off easing the pain of his victims, but in the end he was killing his victims for the sheer love of it. He smothered victims with pillows, poisoned them with arsenic, cyanide, and morphine, turned off life support, killed with coat hangers and tainted medicines. Like many others, his life would end with violence. A fellow prisoner beat him to death in his cell. Number 26, Louisiana. Population 4.6 million. Homicide rate 19.8. Louisiana had 344 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, making it one of the most violent states on our roster. In fact, it is the state where you're second most likely to get murdered by a serial killer. Rising to the occasion is the monstrous Ronald Dominique, also known as the Bayou Strangler, who killed over 23 men and boys on a 9-year killing spree from 1997 to 2006. Despite his large number of victims and the sexually sadistic nature of his crimes, the Bayou Strangler isn't well known outside of the state, partly because many of his victims were underprivileged people living on the margins of society, a common kind of victim for serial killers. Number 25, Alabama. Population 5.1 million, homicide rate 14.9. There's plenty of bloodshed in the heart of Dixie, 199 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. One prime example of this is Thomas Weisenhant, a violent man who ended the lives of 4 women over his criminal rampage from 1963 to 1976. From killing a woman during an armed robbery when he was just 16 years old, to a lifetime of beating and shooting women with no remorse, Weisenhant was sentenced to death in 1977 and finally got the lethal injection in 2010, thanks to the slow wheels of justice. But his crimes are nothing compared to this next monster. Number 24, South Carolina. Population 5.4 million, homicide rate 11.8. This state has known 198 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, but it's never known a killer more infamous than Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, a killer who earned the nickname the Meanest Man. Over the course of his murder spree from 1953 to 1982, he claimed anywhere from 15 to 110 victims, and his killing spree didn't even stop when he was in jail. After being paid to do so, he slipped some C4 plastic explosives into the shoe of fellow inmate Rudolph Tyner, then connected it to a power outlet, killing him. He was executed by electric chair in 1991. While our next killer isn't as prolific, he is somehow even creepier. Number 23, Minnesota. Population 5.7 million. Homicide rate 3.8. Not everyone in Minnesota is so nice, and there are 81 serial killings from 1992 to 2019 to prove it. Most memorable among them is Paul Michael Stefani, also known as the Weepy-Voiced Killer, who claimed 3 victims and tried to claim the lives of 2 more. But the murders themselves aren't what made Stefani famous. After the killings, he would call the police and confess to the murders, while crying and affecting a high-pitched voice. The recordings are still out there if you're brave enough to listen to them. But what about a killer styled after the late great Hannibal Lecter? Number 22, Colorado. Population 5.8 million. Homicide rate 7.2. In the Rockies, no one can hear you scream. There were 161 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and neatly in the middle sit the life and crimes of Scott Lee Kimball, known to some as Hannibal. He's confirmed to have committed 4 murders with connections to around 21. Kimball was a serial forger and con man who became an FBI informant, and during his tenure as an informant, he decided to also begin his serial killer career. That's how he earned his nickname Hannibal. Unlike Hannibal Lecter, he thankfully didn't eat anyone. The same cannot be said for our next killer. Number 21, Wisconsin. Population 5.9 million. Homicide rate 6. This state had 118 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, but its most infamous killing spree went from 1978 to 1991. We're talking, of course, about the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. aka the Milwaukee Cannibal, who mutilated, murdered, violated, and in some cases even ate his victims. As one of the most rightly infamous killers in American history, this nasty customer preyed on gay men of color, the exact kind of people that Milwaukee police wouldn't be looking for. In the end, after being arrested and becoming a morbid celebrity, Dahmer got his just desserts when a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, beat him to death in prison. But let's keep this cannibal train rolling. Number 20. Maryland. Population 6.2 million. Homicide rate 11.4. Maryland can also be a sketchy place sometimes, with 213 serial killings from 1992 to 2019 to prove it. But to the best of our research, the only killer who boasts about turning people into burgers is Joe Matheny, who murdered anywhere from 5 to 13 people from 1976 to 1996 before finally getting caught. While like many killers he exaggerated the specifics for better cred in prison, there's no denying that Matheny was a brutal killer. He murdered several women and confessed to attacking homeless people with an axe. Not the kind of guy you'd want to invite to the neighborhood barbecue, especially if he's bringing burgers. Let's move on, we're getting a little queasy here. Number 19. Missouri. Population 6.2 million. Homicide rate 12.8. Missouri had 350 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. One of our highest numbers on the list so far. One of the state's most notorious killers is Charles Ray Hatcher, believed to have murdered 16 people over the course of his criminal career from 1969 to 1982. He was another killer who used lying and deception for his own gain, feigning mental illness to lessen his charges. But he's nothing compared to this next monster on our roundup. Number 18. Indiana. Population 6.9 million. Homicide rate 8.4. Indiana had 349 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, meaning it was one murder off from matching Missouri's freak. The most infamous of all of Indiana's killers is Herb Baumeister, an unassuming man who murdered 11 to 24 or more men from 1980 to 1995, picking his victims up mainly from gay bars. He lived a double life as his body count rose, being involved in 2 different series of killings, the I-70 stranglings and the Fox Hollow Farm murders. Baumeister killed himself after finding out a warrant was out for his arrest, so our knowledge of why he committed his crimes ends there. He's just as mysterious as our next killer. Number 17. Massachusetts. Population 7 million. Homicide rate 2.5. Talk about mass murder. The state had 200 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and one of the most nightmarish among them was the work of killer, necrophile, and thief Alfred Gaynor, who claimed the lives of 9 victims between 1995 and 1998. The one commonality is that Gaynor liked to get up close and personal with his victims. He beat and strangled the unfortunate women who fell into his grasp. And what happened after, well, that's probably not best to think about. Let's head away from the sea and into the mountains. Number 16. Tennessee. Population 7.1 million. Homicide rate 11. This state saw an upsetting 208 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. And among these is the singularly weird Paul Dennis Reed, also known as the fast food killer, who claimed 7 victims over his killing spree from February to April 1997. Paul had 3 things: an incredibly thick neck, country music ambitions, and homicidal urges. When he couldn't hack it as a musician in Nashville, he decided to make a little extra money robbing fast food places, including a McDonald's, a Baskin-Robbins, and a Captain D's, murdering several people along the way. But for our next killer, murder wasn't a side effect, it was the goal. Number 15. Arizona. Population 7.4 million. Homicide rate 9. Arizona saw 188 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, but 2005 to 2006 were particularly bad for the people in the state. Around this time, the despicable Mark Goudreau, aka the Baseline Killer, was claiming 9 victims, in addition to the rest of his insane crime spree that resulted in 76 total convictions. While Goudreau is the dubious star of this entry, a duo of other killers also known as the serial shooters, Dale Hausner and Samuel John Dietman, were also at large, killing 8 people between them. But these 3 killers combined didn't have the body count of our next killer. Number 14. Washington. Population 7.8 million. Homicide rate 5.4. Washington had 396 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. Because the state seems to have a strange pull over serial killers. Take Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, the second most prolific serial killer by confirmed victims in American history, having murdered 49 to 90 plus women from 1982 to 1998. though it is possible he was killing as late as 2001. Ridgway strangled his victims, most commonly sex workers or runaways, before dumping their bodies. He would sometimes show his victims a photo of his son in his wallet in order to put them at ease before murdering them. And we got bad news, the next is almost as murderous. Number 13, Virginia, population 8.7 million, homicide rate 7.8. The Commonwealth of Virginia was host to 272 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But just before that, Alfredo Rolando Prieto was on the prowl, claiming 9 victims from 1988 to 1990. Like a lot of murderers, he met his demise at the business end of lethal injection. But is it worse to kill for pleasure or business? Number 12, New Jersey, population 9.3 million, homicide rate 3.8. Tony Soprano's stomping ground experienced 232 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, so it only makes sense that this entry is a supposed mob hitman, Richard Kuklinski, also known as the Iceman because of his technique of freezing victims to hide their time of death. He was confirmed to have killed at least 5 people, but claimed to have killed dozens more before he was arrested in 1986. Kuklinski was also a pathological liar who seemed very invested in bolstering his own legacy as New Jersey's ultimate badass, so the specific number he claims should be taken with a pinch of salt. Our next killer, on the other hand, was the real deal. Number 11, Michigan, population 10 million, homicide rate 8.6. Michigan had 425 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, the highest number so far, and their most horrific serial killer was Carl Eugene Watts, also known as the Sunday Morning Slasher, who claimed from 14 to as many as potentially 100-plus victims. From 1974 to 1982, Carl began habitually bludgeoning, strangling, stabbing, and even drowning female victims, which soon became an all-consuming addiction. In the end, he would die of prostate cancer in prison. Hey, all this horror is making us hungry. Anyone want Taco Bell? Number 10, North Carolina, population 11 million, homicide rate 9.2. North Carolina had 295 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and Henry Louis Wallace, also known as the Taco Bell Strangler, was one of the most despicable. He tormented and murdered 11 black women of low socioeconomic status, taking advantage of the police's slow response time and tackling his criminal rampage. This allowed him to claim more victims from 1990 to 1994, leading to substantial criticism of how the investigation was conducted by the Charlotte police. In either case, what happened to Wallace's victims is nothing but an awful tragedy. Now let's look into a certain devil who went down to our next state. Number 9, Georgia, population 11 million, homicide rate 11.3. Keeping up with our trend of escalating violence, Georgia had 409 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and from 1979 to 1981, it's believed that Wayne Williams, also known simply as the Atlanta Monster, slayed from 2 to 30 victims, many of them children. Williams had a variety of modus operandi, from shooting to beating to strangling, and in all cases he displayed extraordinary cruelty. He even made his way into the second season of Mindhunter, which carries a certain degree of serial killer prestige. Number 8, Ohio, population 11.8 million, homicide rate 8.5. Ohio had 505 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, but from 2007 to 2009, the most notorious killer in Ohio was the Cleveland Strangler, Anthony Sowell, who murdered 11 to 14 black women, all but one of which were mothers. He was eventually caught and sentenced to death, but terminal illness took him before the metaphorical hangman could. Our next diabolical killer wasn't so lucky. Number 7, Illinois, population 12.5 million, homicide rate 10.9. We're getting into the really heavy hitters now. Illinois gave us 680 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, but none were more repulsive than the killings that took place between 1972 and 1978. We're talking about John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, whose murderous rampage claimed the lives of 33 or more boys and young men, whose bodies mainly ended up wedged into the crawlspace below Gacy's ranch-style house. Why do some people call him the killer clown? Because he sometimes performed as Pogo the Clown at local events. But Gacy isn't the only killer who tried to cozy up with children. Number 6, Pennsylvania, population 13 million, homicide rate 8.9. Pennsylvania had 462 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, but we can't think of any more disturbing than Harrison Graham, a mentally disabled drug user who murdered 7 women from 1986 to 1987. When not entertaining the local kids with his beloved Cookie Monster doll, he was strangling women to death during sex and then desecrating their corpses. He was only caught when his neighbors detected an incredibly foul smell emanating from Graham's apartment, where he was storing remains. He might have killed many more if he had the same body disposal habits of our next killer. Number 5. New York. Population 20 million. Homicide rate 4.5. New York had recorded 677 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and one of its most gruesome and depraved killers was Joel Rifkin, also known as Joel the Ripper, who killed 9 to 17 women from 1989 to 1993. He was no criminal mastermind, but due to the way that he thoroughly dismembered and destroyed the bodies of his victims, he was able to skirt past the law. Number 4. Florida. Population 22.6 million. Homicide rate 7.2. Here we enter the top 5 states where you're most likely to be killed by a serial killer. Florida accounts for 933 serial killings from 1992 to 2019. But its most infamous killer was executed back in 1989, Theodore Ted Bundy, one of the most sadistic killers in United States history. He murdered 20 to 36 or more women, often returning to their bodies to perform further indignities. Bundy's charm was his greatest weapon, his ability to manipulate himself into the lives of his targets, often winning their sympathies by faking disability. Their kindness would be rewarded with brutal murder. But is everything bigger in the next state, including body counts? Number 3. Texas. Population 30.5 million. Homicide rate 7.6. Texas racked up 984 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, and the state's most notorious real killer puts even some of cinema's scariest killers to shame. Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman, claimed 28 or more victims from 1970 to 1973. He got his Willy Wonka nickname for his habit of handing out free candy to local children, when he and his accomplices weren't brutally murdering them. Corll and his 2 teenage minions lured victims to Corll's various properties where they would be tortured and humiliated before eventually being murdered. The killing spree only ended when Corll was killed by one of his own accomplices. Number 2. California. Population 39 million. Homicide rate 5.9. Thanks to its truly massive population, California accounts for 1,777 serial killings from 1992 to 2019, the most of anywhere in the US. It also has a truly disturbing miracle: the most prolific serial killer in American history by confirmed murders. Samuel Little committed anywhere from 60 to 93 murders from 1970 to at least 2005, though the police have not ruled out those murders starting earlier or later. Little committed his brutal killings, mainly stranglings of women of color, across an alleged 19 different states, often picked up for petty crimes, but never for his truly mind-boggling number of murders. And if we're lucky, Little's record of atrocities will never be broken. And while we counted down these from lowest population to the highest, we saved one state for you where you are statistically most likely to be murdered by a serial killer. And that is, drumroll please, number 1, Alaska. Population 700,000. Homicide rate 10.2. Alaska doesn't have the highest population, but it does have the dubious distinction of being the one where you're most likely to be killed by a serial killer. From 1992 to 2019, the state accounted for 64 serial killings, which means that Alaskans during that time period had a 7 in 100,000 chance of becoming a serial killer victim. That's higher than the national homicide rate and about the same chances as dying from a fall, like off a ladder or down the stairs. The worst serial killer in Alaskan history is Robert Hansen, aka the Butcher Baker, a truly monstrous killer who claimed 17 to 37 victims during his 11-year killing spree from 1971 to 1983. This man's Anchorage atrocities were something straight out of a movie. He sometimes took his young female victims out to the wilderness and hunted them with a rifle. Even on this list of depraved monsters, Hansen's human hunting habits still somehow takes the cake. Are there serial killers in Antarctica? Who is the worst in Europe? Africa had more than you might think, and killers in South America smash records. As for North America, we struggled to pick out one person, but we got there in the end. Let's start with Oceania, the far-flung continent of the world that contains Australasia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. In terms of population, Oceania is small, with only about 44.4 million people living in it. that doesn't mean the continent doesn't have its fair share of barbaric and twisted killers. Something we need to get straight at the beginning of the show is what defines a serial killer. This meaning has changed over time, but according to the FBI website, it's the unlawful killing of 2 or more victims by the same offenders in separate events. This is not the same as a spree killer, even if the spree killers murder many people. To meet the definition of a serial killer, there has to be a cooling-off period between the crimes. One more thing we'll tell you before we go down this blood-spattered rabbit hole today is where the term serial killer came from. As you might know, centuries ago, such crimes were thought to be so abhorrent that they were sometimes blamed on werewolves or vampires or some kind of evil spirit. Later, we heard the term lust killer because many of these crimes involved a sexual element. A German criminologist wrote in the 1930s about Serienmörder or serial murderer, and the term also appeared in the 1966 book by a British author, The Meaning of Murder. In the 1970s, Robert Ressler, famous for his starring role at the FBI's then new behavioral science unit, think Silence of the Lambs, used the term when he was giving a lecture at a British police academy. This is when profiling was becoming all the rage. The New York Times used the term an estimated 233 times in the 1980s, and in the 1990s an estimated 2,514 times. The rest is history. The term serial killer became planted in our minds. But what's fascinating is the media and the movie industry only ever seem to pick on a few of them while not reporting or representing some of the very worst. Today we hope to shed some light on some of those people. Over the years we've researched many killers, so we think we're in a good position to tell you which ones were the most terrifying. Bear in mind that this show is indeed about the most terrifying, not the most prolific or most famous. We're talking about the scariest, the ones who give you nightmares, whose vicious acts leave you both paralyzed with fear and perplexed as to what can go wrong with the human psyche. Oceania. For Oceania, we could have written about the sorcery murders in Papua New Guinea, also known as witchcraft killings, in which entire families were hacked apart just recently after being accused of witchcraft. Then in the same country, there was Stephen Garasai Tari, aka Black Jesus, a pastor and a cult leader accused in the 2000s of murder and cannibalism. But we've chosen Australia for our winning nation in regard to terrifying serial killers, the country that has spawned countless Outback movies in which Australian hicks terrorize backpackers. Such stories are based on the serial killer Ivan Milat, who in the late 80s and early 90s abducted backpackers, hitchhikers, and killed at least 7. His crimes were indeed terrifying. He tied his victims up and in some cases paralyzed them by stabbing them in the spine, further prolonging their torture. In technical terms, he was a hedonistic killer, doing it for pleasure, not as part of some kind of mission, for example, the fictional Dexter, or because he wanted to be with the dead bodies, like lust killers Jeffrey Dahmer and Dennis Nilsen. Since he kept his victims alive and dominated them, he also likely fell into the category of a power control killer. He obviously enjoyed seeing people in pain, so we can say he was a sadistic thrill killer. It's the sadistic thrill killers and also the lust killers that usually scare us the most. This now brings us to Oceania's most terrifying killer, a sadist if there ever was one, but not a lust killer. His name was John Bunting. His crimes took place between August 1992 and May 1999, in and close to the city of Adelaide, South Australia. We guess a few of you might already know his name due to a very realistic movie of the murders titled The Snowtown Murders, a film that is so brilliantly wretched and disturbing it'll make you feel like having the longest shower of your life after watching it. The crimes were so nasty that 3 of the original 15 jurors involved in the trial asked to be removed from the case. They just couldn't handle it. To this day, journalists and jurors receive counseling. John Bunting traumatized an entire nation. Bunting was born on September 4, 1966, in a small town in the state of Queensland. To understand what shaped the man to come, we need to look no further than his childhood, when at the age of 8 he was beaten by the older brother of one of his friends. This older kid then sexually abused him. According to an academic paper on Bunting, when he was young he didn't wet the bed or start fires everywhere, but he did torture animals. These are 3 of the most common behaviors noticed in the childhood of future serial killers. He tortured ants with acid, and later that escalated to killing and skinning cats and dogs. It's said he had an unhealthy interest in anatomy. At age 20, he found the perfect job at a crematorium, and when dead bodies weren't enough, he found work slaughtering animals at the company SA Meat Corporation. Unlike most people, he told friends he took a great pleasure in this line of work. Bunting needed to kill, but it seemed he needed a reason to kill. His reason would be allegations of sexual misconduct, allegations he created all by himself. On August 31, 1992, he took a shovel and beat to death 20-year-old Clinton Douglas Trezise. Bunting later told his friends and accomplices that Trezise had harmed children. That was likely not true, but Bunting was never interested in the facts. He just wanted to kill. When Bunting got rid of the body, he employed the help of a man named Robert Wagner and a 40-year-old pre-op transgender woman, Vanessa Lane, who'd also lived under the name of Barry Lane. Lane and Wagner were in an intimate relationship at this point, but not for long. After Bunting married a woman named Elizabeth Harvey, the mother of a young, not-so-smart boy named Jamie Vlasakis, he became the boy's father figure. Notably, one day Vlasakis told Bunting that when he was 13, his much larger stepbrother, Troy Yude, had violated him. So you can probably imagine what Bunting thought about this. Bunting told him that very soon Yude would get what was coming to him. Vlasakis soon discovered that Bunting had killed and intended to kill again. In fact, Vlasakis' mom had already helped Bunting with one murder, that of the 26-year-old Ray Allen Peter Davies. Davies, who had a very low IQ, was accused of hurting young men. On Christmas 1995, Elizabeth Harvey stabbed him in the leg, and then he was choked unconscious by Wagner. They took Davies to another house where they proceeded to electrocute him with jumper cables and beat him so hard in the genital area that he passed out and died. Bunting now had a taste for torture. He loved it. Wagner loved it. To hurt someone like that and see the life drained from them, it was exhilarating for this group of sadistic killers. On the wall of the room in the house, Bunting had a rock spider wall in which the names of various people were connected with string. Bunting told Vlasakis that these men were all guilty of hurting boys or at least of sleeping with other men. Each one of them, said Bunting, had to go. After 2 more murders, they killed Wagner's partner, Lane. Well, ex-partner. The two had already split up. Bunting had never liked Lane. He put up with her only because Lane was familiar with sexual predators in the area, and she occasionally gave names to Bunting. They tortured her in a bathtub, crushing her toes with pliers, beating her head, and strangling her with a cord, after which she finally died, but not before she'd given up her bank details. While Bunting was a compulsive killer, he also made money from his morbid ventures by taking people's IDs, bank details, and cards. Later, Bunting and his accomplices hanged an 18-year-old paranoid schizophrenic man from a tree. In such a depressed and impoverished area, police didn't even bother to investigate the murder thoroughly. Soon after, Bunting was pricked by a needle left lying on a couch by a substance abuser. He strangled him for that. Then they got Troy Yude, who was then 21. He might have been Vlasakis' half-brother, but after what Vlasakis had accused him of, Bunting was intent on causing him the utmost harm. They tortured him, crushing his toes, and forced him to say that he was going away for a while on recording. As things tend to happen in the killing world, the violence escalated. Bunting would choose names from his spider wall, people who were no doubt innocent of whatever he'd accused them of, and abducted them after gaining their trust. They took 18-year-old Fred Robert Brooks and put him in handcuffs and thumb cuffs. They tortured him for hours, shoving things inside of him, injecting bleach into his life-giving organs, and shocking the same place with electricity. Again, before they got what they wanted, they crushed his toes with pliers, now a trademark of their torture. Their last victim, 24-year-old David Johnson, was not even accused of a crime. Bunting was homophobic. He hated men. He'd accused of touching people they shouldn't touch. He even hated overweight people, who he called a waste of space. But with Johnson, he had no reason to feel such hate. He soon made one up, though. Bunting said Johnson was too tidy. He called him a yuppie, too posh, accused him of looking down on the rest of them. While Bunting and his view had already dumped bodies in the small town of Snowtown, Johnson was the only victim actually killed in Snowtown. Another first with Johnson was that Bunting and Wagner cut off his flesh, fried it, and ate it. They were now cannibals. It was there in Snowtown where police later found 8 victims inside 6 barrels, or what was left of them. It was discovered that a man named Mark Ray Hayden had been helping Bunting dispose of the bodies. One of the victims was actually Hayden's wife, Elizabeth, whom Bunting had tortured and killed as usual, with songs blasting over the screams. Bunting particularly liked the US band Live's album Throwing Copper, which he played while torturing his victims, making them call him God, Master, and Lord Sir. Due to this discovery, the case became known as the Bodies in the Barrels murder. The Guardian reported on Wednesday, December 13, 2000, Bodies in Barrels case grips Australia. The article stated the court heard how handcuffs, knives, rubber gloves, and a machine capable of giving electric shocks were unearthed in the vault alongside the bodies. A pathologist said about the bodies there was cutting, quite a bit of cutting. The number of pieces the legs were reduced to show quite a deal of work in getting flesh off the bones. In court, Vlasakis wept and one time even vomited. He was given 4 consecutive life sentences for his parts in the crimes, compared to Wagner's 10 life sentences and Bunting's 11 life sentences. Wagner, who was illiterate, said in court he did what he'd done because people were doing terrible things to children. He added the authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you. He failed to mention if these people were guilty or not, and he didn't mention that he'd obviously enjoyed torturing them. The judge in response told him, "I am satisfied both of you derived pleasure from the physical act of killing and the violence and torture that preceded some of the killings. I'm also satisfied that you derived pleasure from the defleshing and dismembering of some of the bodies." The court heard how Wagner and Bunting enjoyed the dismembering part, the skinning part, sometimes taking the head of a victim, and inviting each other to kiss the puppet. Now, let's go to Africa, to a country whose #1 serial killer was so bad the police enlisted the help of the serial killer expert we mentioned earlier, Robert Ressler. Africa. Like with other continents, there was no easy choice when picking an African serial killer. We thought about Namibia's so-called B1 butcher, who with precision dismembered at least 5 people between 2005 and 2007 and dumped their bodies along the country's B1 national highway. There have been arrests in the past, but it seems the B1 butcher may still be on the loose. Then there was Haj Mohammed Masfawi, Morocco's most infamous shoemaker who, in the early 1900s, would invite women into his shop, drug them, and then mutilate and behead them. But we've chosen a man named Moses Sitole, aka the South African Strangler, sometimes referred to as the Ted Bundy of Africa. He was born on November 17, 1964, in a town in Gauteng, in the smallest but wealthiest province in South Africa. Wealthiest because about a quarter of South Africa's population lives there, many of whom are residents of the country's largest city, Johannesburg. Sitole's life was certainly not one of riches. His father Simon died young, and his mother Sophie had very little money during his early years in the rough and ready township of Vosloorus. Since Moses' mother was unable to take care of him and his 4 other siblings, they were one day dumped at a police station. Her parting message to them all was, "Please don't give them my name." After that came the orphanage, where the adults systematically mistreated Moses. He tried to run away on several occasions, once going to live with his brother Patrick. From there, he earned a tough living in the province's gold mines, sometimes doing other odd jobs, often walking the streets helping homeless kids. He might have had a soft spot for such children, but he certainly harbored a lot of anger toward women. It seems he could never forgive his mother, the way she told him as a scared little boy, "Please don't give them my name." He despised women, and like Mr. Bundy, Sitole had the gift of gab. He was strong, handsome, and very charming. Witnesses to his case would later come forward and express just how well he spoke, how clever he was, and how he was able to gain the trust of just about anyone. It helped, of course, that women often saw him helping kids in the streets. In 1994, his murder spree began. His method of luring victims was perhaps quite novel. He'd approach women in the street and tell them he was managing an NGO that takes care of children called Youth Against Human Abuse. It looked legit. He had documents. While working at a car wash, Sitole had asked a typist named Melody to type up all those documents. His charm certainly helped, so when he told women he had job openings, they believed him. A witness later explained how he approached one of his victims. He promised her a job, a better job, and money and benefits. He gave her forms for a job. She trusted him because she was excited. She said, "I'm not coming to work tomorrow because this man is taking me on a date to Johannesburg to have some lunch." He wasn't. The only place Youth Against Human Abuse existed was in Sitole's head. That woman who'd been excited about the new job never returned home. Her family became frantic, only to become shocked when a few weeks later, her mutilated body was found in a field. Later, more bodies were found. They soon stacked up. Cops couldn't keep up with it, especially as the bodies were discovered with no IDs on them. As time went on, the police noticed that the killer was becoming more confident. He spent more time with the bodies. He hurt the women in more creative ways. A newspaper explained, "The killer was evolving his murder technique to extract the greatest pain from his victims, assumingly increasing his own pleasure." In fact, the bodies piled up so fast that police felt the need to contact Robert Ressler, the FBI profiler and serial killer expert over in the USA. As many as 30 bodies were found in a matter of a few months. President Nelson Mandela had to cancel trips abroad. South Africa was in a state of panic. Matters were made more chaotic when bodies were found with words written on their skin. On one body, Sitole wrote in broken English, "She is a beach. I am no fighting with you, please. And we must stay here for as long as you don't understand." Were these messages for the cops? In 1995, police discovered that Sithole had been seen with one of the victims, and with his name already on file for a violent sexual crime, they went after him, only for Sithole to go on the run. And that's when he called a journalist at the Star newspaper called Tamsin de Beer. He said he was the killer, calling himself Joseph Maguena. In a phone interview, he admitted to scores of murders, but denied he had anything to do with the murder of a woman and her 2-year-old son. In fact, he had killed the boy, hitting him over the head, after which the kid died in the field from exposure. In a third call, cops tracked the number. It was a payphone, but by the time they got there, Sithole was gone. Police discovered that this Mr. Maguena was actually Moses Sithole, having tracked a number he'd given to some of his victims in the interview process. There was nowhere to run now. Sithole later got in touch with his brother-in-law and asked for a gun. When he met with his brother-in-law, who'd already told the cops, they swooped in on him. The cops shot him twice, once in the abdomen and once in the leg, when he charged at them with an axe. Sithole spent 2 days in critical condition, after which he was interviewed. What's disturbing is that some reports say that while he was admitting to murdering those women, under the sheets he was playing with himself. That was one sick man. He explained to the investigators why he committed those heinous crimes, saying, "I force a woman to go where I want, and when I go there I tell them, 'Do you know what? I was hurt, so I'm doing it now.' Then I kill them." So he blamed his childhood maltreatment for his depravity. He admitted to killing 29 women in the space of just over 1 year, making him arguably the most prolific African serial killer in terms of body count and the short time frame the murders were committed in. Police say they had him on 38 murders, which would mean around 3 murders a month. He was actually suspected of murdering 79 women, which, if true, would make him about the busiest serial killer in African history. 79 in 1 year is a lot. But as you'll see later, others have killed in a similar quick fashion. In subsequent interviews, Sithole said he took great pleasure from watching the women's eyes bulge when he strangled them, often with their own underwear. The full extent of how he tortured his victims was never detailed, but it was written that he put them through absolute horror and agony. A South African newspaper wrote, "The case of Moses Sithole serves as a painful reminder of the existence of evil in our society. This man was hated all over South Africa, and it came as no surprise when on December 4, 1997, he was sentenced to 2,410 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 930 years. He's still in prison today at the Mangaung Correctional Center at Bloemfontein, South Africa's so-called judicial capital. Let's now move to Asia, the largest continent in the world, home to around 4.7 billion people. Asia. With a population that large, it's not easy to choose one serial killer. We might have gone for Ahmad Suraji, the Indonesian killer of 42 women and girls who believed that their deaths would give him supernatural abilities. In terms of evil geniuses, the Vietnamese French psycho scammer Charles Sobrage had a story like no other, which included drugging and murdering backpackers in Bangkok and devising some of the most exceptional prison escapes in world history. In Japan, there was Tsutomu Miyazaki, the killer of young girls who mutilated their bodies and committed unspeakable acts with the corpses. Then there was the butcher of Rostov in Russia, Andrei Chikatilo, who brutally murdered over 50 women from 1978 to 1990. And when we say brutal, we mean it with a capital B. During his confession in 1982, he admitted that the cries, the blood, and the agony gave him relaxation and a certain pleasure. So-called lust killers, killers who mutilate, stab, and dismember solely for sexual gratification, are scary, especially when some of them like to do all of this while the men or women are alive. Then again, doing things with dead bodies or body parts is equally disgusting and exceedingly baffling. You'll learn more about this later in the show, but first, we need to tell you about our #1 pick from Asia, a case that Japanese cops said was unprecedented in the history of the nation. The Japanese media at the time said that they wouldn't print the details of the case since they were too disturbing for human consumption. There were actually 2 killers. Futoshi Matsunaga was born in the city of Kita-Kyushu on April 28, 1961, and his accomplice, Junko Ogata, was born in the city of Kureme on February 25, 1962. The two, who studied together in school in the Fukuoka prefecture, were both from well-off families, especially Ogata, whose family had money from land. They were both smart, they were both good-looking, and they showed none of the signs normally seen in the childhood of a serial killer. Matsunaga was something of a playboy in school. He became a father at age 19, at which point he already had a slew of mistresses. And that's when he met his old school pal Ogata, who soon got into a relationship with Matsunaga despite his marriage. This is why Ogata's mother Shizumi told her daughter to stay away from him. The Japanese press doesn't give many details, but it was said that Matsunaga at one point engaged in sexual misconduct with Shizumi and later persuaded Junko to move in with him. By this point, he'd already divorced his first wife. This was not a nice man. He enjoyed wrecking families. He was chaos walking, feeding from other people's misery. Ogata, who was mentally unstable at times and suffered from depression, was a victim too, in these early days completely under the spell of her deranged lover. There's good reason that he became known as the mind control killer, but that doesn't mean we can forgive Ogata for what happened next. Still, reports say he beat her, he branded her with cigarettes, and using a safety pin and Indian ink, forced her to tattoo his name on her thigh. Matsunaga ticked all the boxes for a psychopath. He was controlling, he showed no empathy, he oozed superficial charm, lied a lot, became bored easily, and had a grandiose sense of self-worth. He was impulsive, parasitic, shallow, a cheat, and showed no remorse or guilt for his actions. But there are psychopaths everywhere. It's often said about 1% of the human population meets the criteria for a psychopath, and the vast majority of them don't kill people for money and pleasure. On the outside, this charming fella looked successful. He owned a futon firm he named World and seemed to be doing okay. Little did people know that one way he had fun at work was by getting his 5 or 6 employees into the soundproof room above the shop and giving them electric shocks. This was 1980s Japan, where folks were generally expected to respect their boss. The Japanese media later reported, translated to English, employees were called there if they were unable to meet their monthly sales quota or if Matsunaga was in a bad mood. A senior employee held him down and wrapped electrical cords with exposed metal around his hands and ankles. One of those employees, who with the other employees lived behind the futon business in a small wooden house, said years later it was a hellish life working for Matsunaga. He explained to the press what the shocks felt like, saying, "It was as if my brain had been hit with an iron rod. I lost consciousness for a moment, but I always woke up with burning pain in my limbs." At the time, Matsunaga told his employees, men he locked in that wooden house, that he knew they had parents and sisters, and if they ever squealed, they would be killed. Those employees had no idea their boss had stolen 180 million yen, about $2.2 million, as part of fraud and blackmail schemes. His scheme fell apart when the cops started investigating him, only for him and Ogata to go on the run. Both of them were then added to Japan's most wanted list in 1992. This is where things turn much darker. While on the run, Matsunaga met a woman he'd known in the past who was married with 3 kids. She immediately fell for the charming Matsunaga and agreed to leave her husband. He told her, "Divorce him and come to me, and I'll take care of your children." At this point, he already had a kid with Ogata, but he told the woman that Ogata was his sister and the kid was his niece. In September 1993, one of the women's children mysteriously dropped dead. She mysteriously died a year later, but not before Matsunaga had defrauded her family of 11.8 million yen, or about $145,000 US. The police have never been able to convict him of these deaths, but it's thought he was the perpetrator. In 1994, he met an estate agent named Kumio Toratani, who was living with his 10-year-old daughter. The two talked about crimes they committed in the past. At that time, Ogata told Kumio she had experience in childcare and would take care of his daughter. What happened next was just plain weird, but maybe that's because of cultural differences between Japan and the West. We should also understand that Matsunaga told Kumio that he wanted to start a business with him, but only if he could completely trust him. The Japanese press reported that on one of Matsunaga and Kumio's drinking nights, Matsunaga pulled out a form and told Kumio he'd have to sign it to prove he wasn't lying about his criminal past. The form was titled Certificate of Facts. Below was written, "I certify that I committed the crime of," and below that a space to write a signature. Kumio signed it, apparently under great pressure, after which Matsunaga blackmailed him. This is when Matsunaga and Ogata took Kumio and his daughter hostage in their own home. They demanded money, saying the two couldn't leave until the ransom was paid. Kumio was then tied up, or as the Japanese press put it, lynched. After being forced into a stress position, Matsunaga would electrocute him if he moved. He was fed little to no food, sometimes being fed his own feces and vomit. They even forced his daughter to bite him all over his body. You can only imagine how distressing this was for the girl. Kumio died soon after, and Matsunaga managed to convince the daughter it was her fault. He told her, "I couldn't take your father to the hospital because of the impression you made on him with your teeth. If I took him to the hospital, they'd immediately know that you killed him, and the police would arrest him." She believed him, she was just a kid. The Japanese press explained, Matsunaga left the disposal of the corpse to Junko and the girl. The two dismembered the bodies using knives, saws, and blenders, boiled them in pots, threw the chunks into the ocean, and disposed of the meat juices in public toilets. He then got the daughter to sign on one of the certificates that said, "I certify that I killed my biological father with murderous intent." He then met a woman who worked for Kumio. As usual, he convinced her he was in love with her, telling her he was a professor at Kyoto University. She and her daughter moved in with Matsunaga, after which they were held prisoner, electrocuted, starved, and beaten, as she was forced to borrow money from all of her relatives. One day, she managed to get free after jumping through a second-floor window, sustaining a broken hip and a crushed lung. It's uncertain how much she suffered as a result, but when found, she was committed to a mental institution. After this failed extortion and murder attempt, Junko Ogata would get extra money from her parents and relatives, the other Ogatas, but it was never enough. In 1997, she went to work in a hostess bar, and one day, she just never returned home. At this point, she lived in a busy house with her own kids and the daughter they'd kidnapped. Matsunaga knew she would have gone to her parents, so he called them. They arranged to meet him in his apartment. Junko's mother, Shizumi, her father, Omare, Junko's sister, Raiko, and her husband, Kazuya, all went, as did Raiko and Kazuya's two children, Aya and Yuki. Big mistake. The Japanese press said that once again he used his mind control to keep them there. Junko turned up later knowing he had her family. As soon as she stepped through the door, she was lynched and electrocuted. But get this, he convinced her family that it was Junko who was in the wrong, and so she deserved it. A Japanese news report stated, "At this point, Junko was more shocked that her family not only took Matsunaga's side, but also that they were placed under his wing rather than being deceived." As time went on, Matsunaga convinced Raiko and Kazuya that Shizumi had gone mad, telling them they needed to strangle her. The story gets confusing here. A lot of money was talked about, and it seems Matsunaga managed to convince family members that they had enemies within their own family. He made them hate and distrust each other, all living in this little apartment. It was about to become the home of a bloodbath. If this sounds unbelievable to you, it does to us too, but we guess there's a reason he was named the Mind Control Killer. He was apparently excellent at that job. In December 1997, he convinced Junko to electrocute her own father, Omare, to death. He forced the remaining members of the Ogata family to cut up the corpse and dispose of it. In January, he convinced Kazuya to strangle his wife, Raiko, and their 10-year-old daughter, Aya. He killed his wife, but not the daughter. Aya would succumb to depravity soon enough, though. Matsunaga then took Kazuya to a bathroom, where he eventually died from starvation on April 13, 1998. Soon after, Matsunaga convinced Junko to kill Raiko's 5-year-old son, Yuki. Talk about a house of horrors. Both her and Junko then tortured Aya. It was Kumio's daughter, who'd been with them all this time, that finally murdered Aya, but under duress. The date was June 7, 1998. Now, the only survivors were Junko's own children. Matsunaga told Junko, "Because you ran away that time, I had no choice but to kill your entire family. It's your fault." On January 30, 2002, Kumio's daughter managed to escape, but Matsunaga found her, took her back to her apartment, and tied her up and electrocuted her. She escaped again in March and this time managed to get to the police. The daughters were taken into care. Everyone testified as to the extreme things they'd seen in that house, although the bodies were never found. Kumio explained how Matsunaga had made everyone hate each other. When he killed her father, he made a stew with the body parts and forced her to eat some. She said he was absolutely inhuman. A neighbor later testified in court, perhaps having smelled the ingredients of that stew, stated, "There was this vile smell that permeated the entire apartment block. People couldn't believe what they were hearing, and in actuality, they only heard the lighter version of the story." In 2005, both Matsunaga and Junko were sentenced to death, but in 2007, Junko's sentence was commuted to life in prison. Just about everyone in Japan said death is too good for these people. Amen to that. Could there be anyone as demented as Mr. Matsunaga? Maybe. Let's now visit Europe. Europe, the home of Jack the Ripper, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, the extremely creepy and cruel couple Fred and Rose West, and the German man Karl Denke, aka the Forgotten Cannibal, who butchered his 40-odd victims in the early 1900s and sold their meat as pork. Then there was Harold Shipman, the British doctor who might have put at least 215 of his patients to sleep forever, but his crimes don't elicit as much fear as other serial killer crimes do. Again, we have scores of people we could choose from going back centuries up to the present day, but the killer we think needs to join this list is Anatoly Onoprienko, the man often referred to as the Terminator or the Beast of Ukraine. By God, did he earn those very grim-sounding sobriquets. In March of 1996, the Ukrainian authorities were under pressure to solve a slew of cases in which people had been massacred in their homes and in the streets. The killer indeed went through them like a Terminator. Out of desperation, the country's security services interrogated and tortured 26-year-old Yuri Mozola, thinking it was him. It wasn't, and the resulting torture ended up being fatal, adding the death of another innocent man to the case. Soon after, the now embarrassed and disgraced authorities received a tip-off. They were told the man they were looking for was Anatoly Onoprienko, a sadist of the highest order, a cruel maniac if there ever was one. There have been few serial killers in world history who were as violent as he was. In 1989, he walked into a house. He'd already scoped the place. He knew how many people lived there and was sure the house was far enough away from other houses that the screams wouldn't be noticed. He could have chosen a family of 3 or 4 or 5, but in this case, he chose a home with a father, a mother, and 8 children. He entered the home and, as planned, used a 12-gauge shotgun to blast the father. He then shot the mother, and one by one he followed the screaming kids around, blasting each one. Hence his nickname, the Terminator. It's hard to even imagine what that scene would have looked like, but he'd only just started. Months later, he saw a Lada car parked off the highway. 5 people were sleeping inside. He blasted them all through the window before they could even realize what was going on. He later said, "I just shot them. It's not that it gave me pleasure, but I felt this urge. From then on, it was almost like some game from outer space." He also said he was angry ever since growing up in an orphanage, leading to his thirst for wanting to cause harm to families. He also said he heard voices too, but that fact is still debated. That night, he got in the car with the dead family and took their valuables. Unlike some of the killers on this list, and especially one we'll talk about soon, he was not fond of dead bodies. He later admitted the stink would send out bad vibes. The smell was unbearable. A few months later, he massacred a family of 4, again with a shotgun. He then killed another family of 4 in their home and gunned down a man in the street who might have seen him leaving the house. In January 1996, he waited on the highway, gun in his jacket, and pulled people over, waving as if he was in distress. When they stopped, he gunned them down. One of the victims was a chef, one was a soldier, and another a taxi driver. 2 weeks later, he broke into another home and massacred a family of 5. When he left the house, he lit it on fire, only to be seen by a 27-year-old railroad worker and a 56-year-old pedestrian. He gunned both of them down. He did something similar 13 days later to another family, and around 2 weeks later, he shot a father and son. He then bashed the mother to death in front of the daughter with a hammer. When the daughter said she had no money, he took the hammer to her too. This man was a thrill killer, a sadist, what we generally call a violent maniac. There was no sexual motive. He was killing for the sake of killing. Albeit he took money and valuables from his victims, they'd have given him everything anyway, he just loved killing. Just over a week later, he engaged in what criminologists sometimes call overkill. He shot the parents, but with the kids he took his time, striking them over and over again with an axe. An hour later, he saw a man near the house, so he shot him to death and hacked up the body. He'd later tell cops he was just getting rid of the evidence, but there was certainly no need to kill every single person in those houses. He enjoyed it, no doubt about that. In an interview, he said one time after he killed the parents, he went to the bedroom where a girl was praying. She hadn't properly seen his face. She was just praying to God that she wouldn't be killed like her mom and pop. He told the investigator, "Seconds before I smashed her head, I ordered her to show me where they kept the money. She looked at me with an angry, defiant stare and said, 'No, I won't.' That strength was incredible, but I felt nothing." He later called it hunting, explaining, "I would be sitting bored with nothing to do, and then suddenly this idea would get into my head. I would do everything to get it out of my mind, but I couldn't. It was stronger than me." This case is special because serial killers these days don't generally wipe out entire families. Sure, there were prolific axe murderers in the US at the start of the 20th century, but in the 21st century, such massacres are rarely heard about. Had this crime been in the UK or the US, there'd already be 7 TV shows made about it, and yet, we imagine most of you have never heard a thing about the Terminator. During the trial, his lawyers argued that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Half the time, he'd ramble to them about being part of an experiment headed by the CIA and Interpol. It was a bit late for MKUltra. "I'm not a maniac," he once said to an interviewer. "If I were, I would have thrown myself into you and killed you right here. I've been taken over by a higher force. I'm like a rabbit in a laboratory, a part of an experiment to prove that man is capable of murdering and learning to live with his crimes." Other times he said such things as, "I love all people, and I love those I killed. I looked those children I murdered in the eyes and I knew that it had to be done. For you, it's 52 murders, but for me, that's the norm. 52. That's the number of kills, except for the first 2 massacres. All of them happened in the space of about 6 months. Ukrainians were upset. It seemed to them the cops hadn't done enough, especially when they heard the killer say people screamed so loudly that they could be heard in neighboring villages, but nobody came to help them. Everybody went into hiding, like mice. He was given a death sentence, but after Ukraine abolished capital punishment, his sentence was commuted to life. Would he kill again if he were ever released? He once said, "If I'm ever let out, I will start killing again, but this time it will be worse, 10 times worse. The urge is there. Seize this chance because I am being groomed to serve Satan. After what I have learned out there, I have no competitors in my field." I will say that South America might say to that, "Hold my beer." Still, killing that many people in 6 months is certainly worthy of the record books. Now let's head over to South America, the continent that contains the most prolific serial killers in modern history. South America. Who to choose? We could go for the monster of the Andes, Pedro Lopez, a Colombian who killed at least 110 girls and women from 1969 to 1980 throughout South America. He claimed it was more like 300. Unbelievably, he was released from custody and is currently in hiding, believed to be out there killing again. In terms of raw numbers, the South Americans come out on top, especially when you consider another top 10 killer, Luis Alfredo Garavito, aka the Beast, also from Colombia, who brutally tortured and murdered young men and boys, beating, cutting, slashing, biting, burning, and doing all manner of other unmentionable things to them as he had them bound. It's believed his body count was 221 from 1992 to 1999, so a higher number than the Terminators, but within a much larger time frame. But we've chosen Daniel Camargo Barbosa for this list, the so-called sadist of El Charquito. He was also from Colombia. We'll just add here, in case any Colombians are upset with us, that we had our eye on serial killers in Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. In the 1970s and 1980s, this sadistic creature murdered at least 72 girls and young women in Colombia and Ecuador. That's the lowest figure. He might well have murdered up to 180 girls. Like many or even most serial killers, Mr. Barbosa had a childhood befitting a nightmare. His cruel mother dressed him up as a girl and sent him to school, where he was beaten up and humiliated. He wanted payback. He started off by drugging girls he persuaded to go to his apartment. You can imagine what he did next. In the early days, he let them go once they came around, but after one girl told the cops about her experience, he was imprisoned in 1964. From here on, he would not leave any more survivors. This guy was like the Pied Piper, the boogeyman, luring young people to follow him, after which, the press reported, he would do his worst and then treated them to what they called an extremely brutal death, often in the middle of forests. He once said he chose the purest victims, the most innocent he could find, because he said they cried more, and he got off on the crying and the screaming. When his victims were young, he'd lure them with the promise of candy or another type of treat or snack. And when the victims were grown up, he'd use his intellect and cunning to get them to follow him. He was very successful at this. After he was caught, a Colombian journalist called him brilliant, saying Barbosa talked about good and evil like a philosopher, often quoting the likes of Hermann Hesse, Sigmund Freud, Garcia Marquez, and Friedrich Nietzsche. He had an answer for everything and was able to speak of God and the devil equally, said the journalist. When Barbosa was finally caught in 1986, inside his briefcase was the book Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Like another killer we'll talk to you about soon, he obviously intellectualized murder. Barbosa admitted to killing 71 girls and women, but as we said, that number is likely much, much higher. We're not going to go through what happened to each victim, because it would be repetitive and just too grim. But we'll say police often found victims had been stamped to death, slashed, stabbed, strangled, and even crushed. His weapon of choice was often a machete. One time, an adult woman hit him on the head with a rock, so to make a point, he decapitated her and threw the head away like it was a piece of trash. With another victim, he cut out the lungs, heart, and kidneys and then gutted her like a fish. Some serial killers, such as the Brit Dennis Nilsen or the American Jeffrey Dahmer, form an infinitely unhealthy relationship with the bodies, but for Barbosa, he wanted to show the utmost amount of disrespect, or at least he did that when they annoyed him. He even sometimes made nasty, taunting phone calls to the victims' families. His karma came knocking, but not until after he'd served his second prison sentence. After 10 years in prison in Colombia, he escaped, only for the authorities to announce that he would have been eaten in the shark-infested waters he entered. But that wasn't true. At this so-called Colombian Alcatraz, Barbosa had studied the ocean currents before he leaped into the water. He managed to get to Ecuador, where he carried on killing more than 50 times. only for two cops to get him minutes after he killed a girl in the capital city of Quito. Not only was he carrying that Dostoevsky book, but he was also carrying her bloodied clothes and a part of her sliced-off sexual organs. On November 13, 1994, at Quito's infamous Garcia Moreno prison Carmago, his new cellie, 29-year-old Giovanni Arcesio Noguera Jaramillo, forced him at knife point to kneel and said, "It is the hour of vengeance." He stabbed him 8 times and took an ear as a trophy. Noguera later told the guards that he was avenging the death of his aunt, one of the many victims of this sadist of El Charquito. Antarctica. Out there in the research stations, life can get pretty lonely, and people have been known to lose their minds somewhat. While there have been violent attacks in the past, we're yet to see an incident that could be turned into a movie like The Shining. Still, in 2018, media reported that one man had lost his mind due to a bit too much Antarctic desolation and cold. AP reported that a Russian researcher named Sergei Savitsky suffered an apparent emotional breakdown and stabbed a welder multiple times. The welder survived, and Savitsky was sent back to Russia to undergo some mental checks. There have been a few cases of violence out there in the world's most remote wilderness, but as of yet, no serial killers. Well, not like this next continent, which has had quite a lot of them. North America. If we look at data regarding the number of serial killers that have been documented in each country, the top 10 list looks a bit like this. Bear in mind, the FBI says there are around 25 to 50 serial killers working in the USA at any one time. United States, 3,204. England, 166. South Africa, 117. Canada, 106. Italy, 97. Japan, 96. Germany, 85. Australia, 81. India, 80. Russia, 73. The US might seem way ahead, but you also need to bear in mind that the US has been publishing information about serial killers for far longer than most other countries. Some countries that are somewhat closed off from the rest of the world, such as China and Russia, have no doubt suppressed information about their maniacs. You should also bear in mind the population of countries listed and the fact that some of these countries' police forces are much better at detecting killers, such as the US. Now, the US isn't as bad as the numbers suggest, but the country does seem to have quite a few serial killers. That might be because serial killers are so well reported that they become kinds of celebrities, and there's evidence that this can create copycats. In no other nation do killers get so much exposure. In the US, more often than not, they become famous. Okay, so who would be the worst in North America? We could, of course, have played it safe and chosen the psycho Ted Bundy, but he doesn't frighten us like some of the others. Sure, Bundy's creepy, charming personality was petrifying, but we still think we need to look elsewhere. We could have chosen Ed Kemper, the high IQ, seemingly sweet man who slept with the decapitated heads of his victims. Or Ed Gein, who doesn't have a high kill count, but gets points for making skin suits from his victims that he actually wore and fashioning a belt made from nipples. Jeffrey Dahmer slept with the bodies and tried to create zombies as slaves by injecting chemicals into his drugged victims' heads. Oh, then you have the utterly depraved sadists, the toolbox killers, the quite familiar freeway killer, and one of the scariest men in history who hardly ever gets a mention in the American press, Dean Corll, aka the Candyman, who horrifically tortured at least 28 boys on his torture wall in the early 70s after sometimes luring his victims with free candy. He fastened those teenagers to his infamous wall and used everything in his vile torture kit. After reading several books on North American serial killers, we'd say it was Corll's depravity that shocked us the most. The man was just insanely cruel. Even so, we're not choosing him. We decided on a sicko named Melvin Reese. 1, because he deserves to be here, and 2, because his story hasn't been as publicized as the rest of the killers we've mentioned. His nickname was the Sex Beast, which gives you a pretty good idea of what you're about to hear. His other nickname is perhaps more confusing. That was the Bebop Nietzsche Necrophile. Peter Vronsky, an author we've mentioned many times before who's done a lot of work on serial killers, introduced us to Reese in one of his books, a man Vronsky called a deeply twisted person with monstrous impulses. He was indeed monstrous, and yet he looked like a talented, intelligent, stable human being who you'd gladly invite over for dinner and be proud that he was the date of your daughter. He wasn't creepy or slimy like Bundy, or quiet like Kemper, or plain weird like Dahmer. This is one serial killer who, to everyone around him, was just a cool, friendly, and clever guy. For us, that makes him all the more terrifying. He could be your best buddy, your uncle, your teacher. We don't know much about his childhood, but we do know that in 1946 he joined the US Army and went to Europe, where he earned his bread as a military musician. On his return, he studied at the University of Maryland, where he proved he was an excellent musician, notably with a saxophone, piano, and clarinet. Jazz music was his biggest love, well, we guess after killing. After dropping out of uni, playing jazz in bars was how he made a living. Everything looked quite normal in his life. In 1954, he got married, and later he and his wife, Elaine, had a son, Philip. Things were not as normal as they seemed, though. In 1955, he attempted to abduct a 36-year-old woman. However, she escaped before he could drive away with her. Seems police got involved, but the woman decided in the end not to press charges, a decision that might have cost quite a few people their lives. Now we move to June 1, 1956, where 18-year-old Mary Fellers and 16-year-old Shelby Venable are looking for a good time. These two youngsters are rebels without a cause. They love hitchhiking, looking for music and fun, much to their parents' concern. This is an era of beat writing and jazz music. The girls don't want to be tied down, they want to discover America, like the author Jack Kerouac. That night, they were waiting at a bus stop with the intention of heading to North Laurel in Maryland when a blue sedan pulled up. The girls got in the car as if they knew the man. They then got out again to switch positions. They seemed very comfortable with the guy, a cool cat with a cute face who impressed young women with his deep talk about philosophy. It wasn't until June 14th that Shelby's body was found face down on a patch of water at a place called Catoctin Creek in Virginia. Mary's body was found nearby. Both girls had died at the same time or thereabouts. Shelby had been strangled, and Mary's cause of death was never ascertained. It was later discovered that the girls had been a little bit too obsessed with a handsome jazz player at a club. His name was Melvin Reese. He was indeed a cool cat. That year, 16-year-old Nancy Chomet and her buddy, 14-year-old Michael Ryan, went missing. The two had taken a shortcut through the University of Maryland as they wanted to pick up Nancy's report card from the school. They never got there. Their bodies were found later by a dog walker. They'd been shot by a .22 rifle. In both these cases, pathologists said it didn't look like the killer had been sexually motivated. The victims were young and without known enemies. So, wondered the cops, why had they been murdered in cold blood? It didn't really make much sense. And in those days in Maryland, this kind of thing was not common. The golden age of serial killing in the US was only just starting. This was one of the cases that kicked it off. Now, we must go forward in time to June 26, 1957, when 36-year-old Margaret Harold and 31-year-old Roy Hudson had turned down a small country lane off Maryland's Defense Highway after having some food and beers earlier. They notice a car, after which a man walks toward their car. He tells them, "What do you think this is, a national park?" The man said it was his job to watch over the area. He then asked the couple for a smoke and asked them if they could give him a ride. When the man got in the car, Roy shuffled to the back, after which the mysterious, well-spoken, handsome man pulled out a snub-nosed steel revolver. The man was about to tie their hands when Roy told him he would not be able to get his cash if his hands were tied. The man replied, "Don't worry, I'll get your money." Boom. He then shot Margaret in the back of the head, and she slumped over. Roy, seeing an opportunity, burst through the car door and started running for his life. He got to a farmhouse and called the police. When cops got to the car, Margaret's brain matter was splattered everywhere. The man who killed her, described as about 35, white, 6 foot, 170 pounds, had violated her dead body, a pure sicko. Roy then told them that he'd seen a green car parked nearby, which might have belonged to the killer. The car was near a shack, said Roy, and when the cops crept up to that shack, they found some cord lying around. Worse, when they entered the run-down, dirty abode, they were greeted by something out of a nightmare. The walls were covered in photos, horrid photos of autopsies and women tied up. Scenes of death and torture taken from what seemed like true detective magazines confronted these cops. This was the 1950s. They really didn't know what to think. We'll just say here that there were many serial killers in the US in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who admitted after being caught they were avid readers of detective magazines that often depicted murder and cannibalism. They were a huge craze back then, in an era that had just gone through a world war and was involved in a paranoid and violent Cold War. Back to the scene, police then noticed another photo. This time, it was a regular photo of a girl who looked high school age. This was just as shocking to them. Vronsky describes the scene as police walking into a pervert's lair. Now, dear viewers, we think you can understand what kind of things in the past inspired numerous Hollywood movies. Any number of films have depicted what these cops saw that day. Actually, the rest of the story you've seen presented in Hollywood thrillers time and time again. Not long after this grisly and frankly weird find, a couple, Irwin Adams and Denise Eggleston, walked into the police station looking like they were in shock. They said they'd just been parked in a quiet area when a guy came up to their car and threatened them with a .39 blue steel snub-nosed gun. The man managed to tie them up partly, but both escaped on foot, barefoot. The man gave chase, but they managed to outrun him. It was around this time that police found the high school girl in a photo of the pervert's lair. Her name was Wanda Tipton. They half expected her to be dead, but she was alive and well. They asked if she'd ever met any strange men, to which she said no. She was lying. She'd been dating this super cool cat, a philosopher, a jazz player intellectual. But she was married, so she told the police she met no one, so as to not get Reese in any trouble. Soon after, another couple in a car met a man with a gun. That man stuffed the male into the trunk and tied the woman up. When he was done with her, he told her, "You're a good woman. I'm glad this wasn't worse than it was." She was in shock. She didn't know what to say out of fear for her life. The man allowed them to run off into the nearby woods. On Saturday, January 11, 1959, 29-year-old Carol Jackson, his wife Mildred, and their daughters, Susan, 5, and Janet, 18 months, all went missing after visiting Mildred's parents in Louisa, Virginia. Their car was found about 10 miles away on the side of the road, the keys still in the ignition. Soon, newspapers were all over the story talking about a whole family disappearing into thin air. Some talked UFOs and others mentioned witchcraft. Entire families don't just vanish. The next March, 2 farmers were driving when their truck got stuck in the mud. When one of them went to put branches under the tires, he noticed a shoe, and then an ankle, and then a leg. It was Carol. Police found that he'd been beaten badly around the face and shot through the head. The youngest daughter was found next to him. It was likely she'd been in his arms when he was shot, and so he'd suffocated her when he fell into the mud. But where were the others? Later in March, 2 teenage boys, John and Patty, were playing with their BB guns close to that pervert's lair in Maryland when they thought they saw the hair of an animal, maybe a squirrel. They shot at it only to realize this was no animal. They walked up to it and poked it. One of the boys later told the police, "I thought it was a baby doll, then I saw it was a human." Cops gave this man the name the Beast. He'd done terrible things to the mother, beaten her so badly her lungs packed in. He also beat the girl to death. Not only that, he committed disgusting necrophilic acts with the corpse. What kind of maniac would do such a thing? One of the reasons we're telling you this story is that the Sex Beast is a historical true crime tale because it was the first time the FBI were called in to investigate a serial killer. Up until then, they'd had no interest in such cases, according to Vronsky, who cited Robert Ressler. Still, it seems the FBI was no better than the police forces in Maryland and Virginia at solving the case. It was plain good luck when they got a lead on Reese. They spoke to his roommate, who'd contacted them, and told him his buddy had some very weird ways of looking at life. He told him that Reese, now divorced, a brilliant musician, was fascinated with existential philosophy. The roommate said Reese often told him that existential theory was that there are individual standards of right or wrong. So in some ways, you can make up your own ethics. You can't say it's wrong to kill, he told the roommate. Reese seemed to be expressing the Nietzschean thing about master morality and slave morality. The masters, according to Nietzsche, make their own morals, and the slaves follow. The slaves, Nietzsche said, resent the masters, and that creates problems in society. What Nietzsche didn't say is that it's okay to kill, but that's how Reese and also Adolf Hitler interpreted the precept. The roommate also said about Reese, anything he reads he likes to experience. He's a thrill seeker, I guess. Reese's mother later said her son would often talk about violence just being a form of self-expression, and no one had the right to take that away from a person. She made him sound like the killer from the movie Seven, saying that he'd often tell her some people in today's sick society shouldn't have the right to live. There are some things I find pleasure in doing, he told his disturbed mother. She later told the police he cheated at games, the trait of a psychopath. She said he was fascinated by not just the murders and detective magazines, but he loved reading about Nazi atrocities. He liked Nietzsche, but held to the views of the anti-naturalist Arthur Schopenhauer, whose philosophy kinda said life was so painful that it's not even worth being born. She said her son would stay up all night on illegal substances reading books written by these people, and worse, he was obsessed with the writings of the original sadist, the Marquis de Sade. On June 20th, 1960, police arrested him, a man they said was smart and mild-mannered. According to Vronsky, there are varying stories about Reese's childhood, but it seems he was a good kid who liked animals. He was clever and well-liked. His father said his son was always kind and sympathetic and could not hurt any living thing. Apparently, Melvin's own son absolutely adored him. After his arrest, his fellow students came out of the woodwork, calling Reese talented, versatile, mild-mannered, intelligent, and friendly. Even his ex-wife said he was all those things, plus he never lifted a finger to her and wasn't into any strange sexual stuff. He was a good husband, she said, but he left her. The B-movie actress and topless dancer Pat Barrington, who'd starred in such movies as Orgy of the Dead, The Satanist, and hedonistic pleasures, had also dated and lived with Reese, and it seems they got along just fine. But when the police raided his house, part of the evidence they found was his death diary. In it, he wrote such things as drove to the select area and killed the father and baby. Now the mother were all mine. He emphasized the all mine part. Police refused to make public what he'd done to them as it was too gory, too disgusting. But they did publish the part where he wrote, led her to a place of execution and hung her. I was her master. This is why we've chosen this story. It is mind-boggling how such a clean-cut, well-liked, obviously intelligent man with no history of trauma or violence could become such a maniac. This was a Jekyll and Hyde case like no other. Such killers throughout history are very, very rare. At trial, he looked like a Hollywood movie star and sounded like an intellectual. But in prison, he began to lose his mind. In 1985, he gave an interview to a journalist working for the Richmond Times-Dispatch and admitted to killing Mary Fellers and Shelby Venables. Although he denied killing Ryan and Shamet, he died from heart issues in 1995 while serving time in a federal facility in Missouri. Did you know some of the most vile, sadistic, warped killers in history got away? Most of them you won't have even heard of. Some of them right now could be living in a town near you, watching you, stalking you. And if two hardworking former detectives are right, they're conspiring to plan your murder on the dark web. This is for real. You'll hear about this underground group of modern American killers in due course, but before we talk about the present, let's look at the past. The New York Ripper murders. Many serial killers enjoy being front-page news. They thirst for the attention, which, as you'll see throughout this video today, is very problematic for society as a whole. Perhaps no one has had more attention than Jack the Ripper, the unknown maniac that worked at a time when London was the center of the media world. His story has been told a quadrillion times, and it seems he might have inspired copycat killers. Between March and May of 1915, the Ripper came back to life, although he was now called the New York Ripper. He brutally killed two young folks in some East Side tenements of Manhattan. Only 27 years after Jack did his business in London, stories of the New York Ripper filled the American press, leading to angry mobs taking the law into their own hands. The Brooklyn Daily Times said there was a ghetto Ripper. People read that a lunatic was on the loose. This caused panic in every household in this mostly poor area. This new Ripper taunted police with letters signed Jack the Ripper, saying he would kill again at random. 100 cops were soon assigned to the case. What's shocking is the Ripper wrote letters to the mothers of the victims. In one letter he wrote, "Dear Mrs. Murray, I really feel sorry for you, but when the excitement cools off again some evening after dinner, I'm going out to kill again. You must understand that I must see blood and cut flesh." So Jack the Ripper, or someone like Jack the Ripper, chose New York City as his hunting ground. The press sold newspapers while the public lost its collective mind. Soon a news report stated, "Man mobbed as Ripper." It explained that a cop had to draw his gun to stop the mob from killing the man. Another story talked about a man who was seen hanging around outside Lafayette Street School. 100 students chased him down. It was a delirious time, full-on mass hysteria. For Italians, then mostly quite new to the city, it became a perilous time after a cashier who'd sold one of the victims some milk before she was killed said she'd seen a foreign-looking man who she said looked Italian. Some newspapers then discussed these new immigrants and their alleged strange customs. The New York Tribune wrote, "It's well known that among certain ignorant immigrants from the south of Europe, there is a superstitious belief that by sacrificing a little girl, they can be cured of certain complaints." This immediately put Italians' lives at risk from the mob, even though the story was based on nothing but an idle rumor. Alas, the New York Ripper was never found, and things eventually calmed down. The next killer deserves a place in the serial killer hall of infamy. If there was such a thing as the Ripper's Ripper, it would be this guy, the worst of the worst, the Cleveland Torso Murderer. The story of this very real Ripper takes place around the southeast side of Cleveland, Ohio, in an area that was known as Kingsbury Run. That's why the killer was also referred to as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The killer gained his nickname after his custom of dismembering all of his victims, 7 men and 5 women, who were all found in pieces here, there, and everywhere. The hand that killed them obviously knew a lot about anatomy, just as Jack the Ripper had. As happened in London, the Cleveland Ripper chose poor, disenfranchised people as his victims. Modern researchers have called such people less dead because when they're dead, they don't matter as much as other folks with a higher social status. The Kingsbury Run area was then known as the Hobo Jungle, famous for its gambling dens, raucous brothels, vagrants, booze, and nightly punch-ups. It was one of the so-called Hoovervilles, depressed and often violent shantytowns that popped up all over the U.S. during the era of the Great Depression. Still, the authorities did try to get the man. They even put Elliot Ness on the case, the leader of the so-called untouchables that went after the illegal booze maverick Al Capone during Prohibition. It was the sheer gruesomeness of the case that compelled the U.S. government to send their best man. In September 1934, a woman who was in her mid-30s was found. Well, her torso and thighs were, which were reported back then as rotting slabs of human flesh, found on the shores of Lake Erie. Two fishermen on Lake Erie later said they found her head bobbing up and down in the water. She became known as the Lady of the Lake after a young girl swimming in the lake said she saw a hand waving at her from the water. What's notable is that the coroner, Mr. A.J. Pierce, said there were signs of a preservative chemical on the skin of the victim. Where would one find such chemicals? You'll see soon. It was about a year later that two young men were found, each missing their head. One body had been drained of blood. Coroner Pierce said the cause of death was decapitation. The victim was later identified as 28-year-old Edward Andrassy, described by newspapers and cops as a snotty punk who occasionally got involved with prostitution and weed. The other body, which had signs of a chemical preservative on the skin, was not identified. Both men were also missing their manhood. Notably, unlike Jack the Ripper, the mutilations happened while the men were still alive, but the decapitation part was given as the actual cause of death. This was utterly brutal, but cops believed the killer must have drugged the victims first. The Cleveland News at the time had asked, what fantastic chemistry of the civilized mind converted him into a human butcher? In January, June, and July of 1936, more bodies were found, and the signature of the murders was the same. They were headless, and if they were men, they were found missing their genitals. In September of that year, a man tripped over something while trying to hop onto a train. He soon realized it was the upper half of a person's torso. When the police were recovering the other half from a muddy pool nearby, 600 people turned up to watch. The case shook America. Still, the Cleveland Ripper, while arguably 100 times worse than Jack in terms of severity, was not major global news. His story was never printed on thousands and thousands of newspapers or even given the major Hollywood blockbuster treatment. Despite Ness's efforts, including 5,000 interviews, he couldn't get his man. He decided the best thing to do was burn the entire shanty town down, making very poor people even more desperate in the process. Even back then, such a hardline act elicited widespread criticism. Ness was made more furious in 1938 when the killer left two of his victims, or parts of them, right near City Hall in clear view of Ness's office. This was an obvious taunt. Body parts were now being found on local streets. As one writer explained, they were literally tripping over bodies. In 1939, County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal, who was thought to be a potential suspect. He made a confession which some say now was staged. Cops broke 6 of his ribs, after which Dolezal was found dead in his jail cell. That hardly sounded like top detective work. The press then wrote about a mysterious man they called the Dr. X, an alcoholic physician that had lost his mind and eventually his practicing license. His name was Francis Edward Sweeney, a well-known member of an influential Cleveland family, and was the cousin to the U.S. Congressman Martin L. Sweeney. Francis was a veteran of World War I and no doubt suffered from what we now call PTSD. He drank all day, often flying into blind rages. He was crushed by anxiety and depression. He also had nerve damage from a gas attack in the trenches. What's more, he worked as part of a medic unit which performed amputations in the war. After the war, he worked in a hospital. Between 1933 and 1938, when the murders happened, Sweeney's erratic behavior at the hospital resulted in 5 competency hearings. He barely passed each one. A man also accused Sweeney of once drugging him. This man claimed to have been given the drugs in an office, which was Sweeney's, and just so happened to be next to the coroner's room where sharp scalpels and preservative chemicals could be found. Sweeney also failed a polygraph test once he became a prime suspect. Still, Ness didn't think he had much of a chance of convicting a man of such high standing in Cleveland. Before he could be tried, Sweeney committed himself to a mental hospital from where he wrote Ness threatening letters for years to come. There was only ever circumstantial evidence against him though, so Sweeney was never charged. It's worth noting that as soon as Sweeney committed himself, the murders stopped. Now for the exceptionally grisly murders that inspired many of the horror movies you've enjoyed. Still, we bet you've never even heard these stories before. American Maniacs and Mad Axe Murderers. On May 23, 1918, husband and wife Joseph and Catherine Maggio were sleeping soundly in their bed in New Orleans when a mysterious man walked up to them and slit their throats with a very sharp razor. For good measure, he took an axe to them. Joseph actually lived long enough for his brothers to discover him crawling around, although he died soon after. The killer became known as the Axeman of New Orleans, who may have hacked and killed 6 and injured 6 more. He, or someone pretending to be him, once wrote a letter that was published in the local newspapers, in which he threatened to besmear New Orleans with blood and brains if he didn't see jazz being played on a particular night all over the city. That night, every bar, every hotel, and even people in their homes listened to jazz. He didn't kill anyone that night. This was shocking to Americans all over the country, but in those days, they were hearing more and more about crazed killers than they had in the past, particularly axe murderers. According to serial killer researcher Peter Vronsky in his book Sons of Cain, between 1900 and 1950, the U.S. saw an increase in serial killers, and many of them chose the axe as their preferred tool for their nasty deeds. In that half-decade, Vronsky counts 171 serial killers, or 3.4 new ones every year. Other researchers have written that there were particular bad runs from 1911 to 1915 and also from 1935 to 1941. It seems war years were bad years, but that's hardly surprising given the madness of war. But there was one axe murderer that came before the two wars. He was later referred to as the Servant Girl Annihilator. A cool title for a video game, but a scary one for a person to have. This killer struck between 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas. And guess what? People started saying it was England's Jack the Ripper, who may or may not have decided that the weather was much better over the pond. In 1885, the New York Times wrote that 2 servant women in Austin were dragged from their beds and murdered. The article said, "The crimes of last night surpass all others in brutality." The Times said, "The servant women of Austin had been under attack for over a year." The article said 7 black women and 4 white women had been killed the same way, mutilated by an axe. The article explained that most of the women had been outraged, which back then meant something very different from what it means today. We think you can guess what that entailed. We'll just say it had to do with indecency. There's no need to go into details. Word spread about the attacker. Everyone had their own theory about who it was. Some of the African American community who practiced voodoo thought the killer was a white man who had magic powers to make himself invisible. Otherwise, they said, how do you explain how he got in and out without even making a dog bark? Indeed, this guy was like a ghost. Hundreds of cops were then assigned to look for the man. Some thought there might be a group of men doing it and that there was some kind of dark conspiracy. No one was ever convicted. As we said, axes were often the weapon of choice, likely because axes were everywhere in those days, and perhaps there were copycats. A man named Henry Lee Moore would walk into people's houses and massacre everyone with an axe, usually one he found lying around near the house. He'd just knock on the door and proceed to murder everyone. This is the theory. There could have been multiple mad axemen. The theory states he killed 23 people in total, all with an axe. In September 1911, he chose a house in Colorado Springs, using a handy axe to kill the father, mother, and 4 kids. A month later, he traveled to Illinois, where he did the same to a family of 3. That same month, he massacred a family of 5 in Ellsworth, Kansas. He went to Villisca, Iowa in 1912, when his axe rampage killed 6 members of a family and 2 of their guests. Moore was a prime suspect for that one, but was never convicted. There are so many axe murders back then that it's very likely that some of these deaths were caused by copycat killers. Moore was only arrested after he murdered his mother and grandmother, and even then, the cops didn't immediately link the crimes with the other axe murders. This is sometimes called linkage blindness. In the early 19th century, cops from different states didn't collude. They barely even linked anything if it happened in another state. On July 4, 1911, the Baltimore Sun ran a story about another axe killer. It was said the victim so far had been mixed race, although some later stories refute that. The axe killer was very much real, though. The so-called Atlanta Ripper sent shockwaves throughout the city. People were afraid to leave their houses. The maniac was doing terrible things to these people's bodies with his axe. A daughter of one victim survived an attack, describing the man as a large black man who was powerfully built and neatly dressed. But no one was ever convicted for these horrific murders that took 21 people. Police didn't even know if they'd all been committed by the same person. The question should also be asked, did the cops try very hard given the victims were poor and, in this case, black? Were they less dead? In 1911 and 1912, there were equally brutal murders, 49 in Louisiana and Texas. Again, the killer walked into family houses, probably just after knocking on the door, and then wiped everyone out in the most extreme fashion. In San Antonio, this axe killer, or someone copying him, murdered a family of 5. It's likely the same killer returned to the city the next year and axed to death another family of 5, and then 3 days later in Hempstead did the same to a family of 3. In Louisiana, he slaughtered the 3 members of the Byers family. In February 1911, he killed a family of 4 in Lafayette, and later in November, he returned to the same city and chopped and slaughtered a family of 6. Over in Denver and Colorado Springs that year, 7 women were bludgeoned to death by an axe man or an axe woman. In just about all of these cases, no money or valuables were taken from the houses. This was a time of axe madness, recently discussed in the book The Axes of Evil. Back then, the stories barely even made it out of the state, never mind being exported worldwide. They were likely the work of males, since males generally kill more than women. These days, only about 17% of all serial murders in the U.S. are committed by women. About 10% of all murders in the U.S., serial or not, are committed by women. We don't know the stats for the early 1900s, but we can be sure women did kill back then. Still, we imagine there were more mad axe men than mad axe women. All ethnicities have had their serial killers throughout American history. White males have made up the brunt of American serial killers. African Americans, according to Scientific American, comprise the largest racial minority group among serial killers, representing approximately 20% of the total. Still, it's mostly white males whose murderousness gets turned into movies and TV shows. It's also interesting that the data shows that serial killers tend to kill people of their own ethnicity. Oftentimes, they start in places they're familiar with, but then expand to new areas as they progress. What's important is that the American serial killer was becoming something of a household celebrity in the early 20th century, more so than in other countries, which might be one reason why the US has way more reported serial killers than anywhere else. We have to make this distinction because while it seems like the US is the serial killer capital of the world, that's not the whole truth. According to data from the Radford University Serial Killer Information Center, the U.S. is top with 3,204 recorded serial killers since serial killers started being recorded. Keep in mind that the U.S. was one of the first countries to recognize the phenomenon of serial killers, so data from the U.S. started to be collected a lot earlier than in other countries. England, which is super close to the U.S. in cultural terms, was next with just 166 serial killers, but if we take population into account, this figure is not as impressive considering the US has around 5 times as many people. No country, large or small, can touch the US where serial killers are concerned. Although for countries with larger populations, like India and China, we have to keep in mind the previously mentioned population difference. Maybe the US is a country where serial killing for fame has become attractive to many people, because it wouldn't make sense that the US just breeds more natural-born killers than other nations. Or maybe countries with similar or larger populations are underreporting or just not publishing their serial killer data, and countries with strict media censorship are not letting the stories get out there. The second seems a lot more likely. The Doodler. The Doodler was like no one else. He was the artistic type, which you don't often find with serial killers. In 1974 and 1975, he murdered between 6 and 16 men in San Francisco, with each victim showing similar types of stab wounds. He met the men in areas known for the city's gay scene. The reason he got the name the Doodler is that one of the men he assaulted but failed to kill said he met the man while he was sketching caricatures. Police say they had a good description of the Doodler. They say he was 19 to 25 years old, he was described as black, lanky, and around 6 feet tall. Police have also released a sketch of what the man might look like now in his early to mid-60s. One of the problems with the case is some of the witnesses were not willing to testify since they wanted to keep the fact that they were homosexual under wraps. In fact, investigators said they were pretty sure their suspect was guilty, but they had their hands tied as some witnesses just wouldn't have their day in court. In 1977, the Associated Press wrote, "Murder suspect free because gay is silent." Such a headline didn't seem fair to some people. The activist Harvey Milk, who became San Francisco's city supervisor only to be assassinated in 1978, said there was pressure on the men. They had families to think about, wives and children. So, this is a strange one. Police think they know who killed those men but are powerless to do anything about it. The case is still open, with detectives now trying to secure a conviction through DNA technology. As things stand, serial killing only makes up about 1% of all the murders in the U.S. The National Vital Statistics System said in 2021 there were 26,031 homicides in the U.S. So that would mean, if FBI estimates are correct, about 260 of them would be the work of active serial killers. The FBI said before that at any given time there are between 25 and 50 serial killers operating in the U.S. By the end of the show, you'll believe that's a fact. You might also believe the estimate is too low. Obviously, these numbers can change year to year, and it's not an exact science. 1970 to 2000 saw a bumper crop of serial killers. This is referred to as the golden age of serial killers. And we wonder why there are so many serial killers in the USA. These days, it's much harder to go around chopping people up with axes, as there are so many CCTV and other cameras around. The axe murder of Texas and Louisiana wouldn't have gotten far in 2023, not with smart doorbells and such. It's sometimes said there are 70 million surveillance cameras in the US, although the number changes a lot depending on the source. Still, you're never far away from a camera. Serial killers are now at least more forensically aware, and they pick their moments and places better, as you'll soon see. Now let's turn our focus outside of the US. Bible John. Imagine if you were a woman and you were on the dance floor of a nightclub dancing across from a good-looking fella. He then went over to you and shouted in your ear, "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." What a turn-on that'd be. The guy is a hottie for sure, so despite his strange sweet talk and the fact that he won't even have a drink, you decide to go home with him. On the taxi ride there, he's suddenly very quiet. Then all of a sudden, he leans into you and whispers, "To preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress, do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes." You'd be somewhat turned off, which is how we imagine the three women felt who'd met Scotland's notorious Bible John at a ballroom in Glasgow in the late 1960s, a place Bible John told a victim's sister was an adulterous den of iniquity. This guy got his strange nickname because women who met him before he killed his third victim said he'd introduced himself as John, only to start quoting the Old Testament on the topic of adultery. In the taxi with the last victim, he told one of her friends, "I don't drink, I pray." John beat and strangled his dates just minutes from their homes. This should have been a fairly easy case. Many people had seen him. He was obviously very religious. He was young and handsome. A sketch of him was seen by just about every person in Glasgow, while hundreds of men stood in lineups. Yet Bible John disappeared, and he remains on the loose today. Or more likely, he's dead, not in ballroom heaven, but in disco hell. The Butcher of Mons. The same goes for the Butcher of Mons in Belgium. He just disappeared. From January 1996 to July 1997, he dismembered 5 women with what police said was precision skill. The killer put various parts of their bodies into bags, where after people found them, some containing feet or a head, and some hands and organs. He didn't even hide the bags, he just left them close to the road. The case remains a mystery today. Cops have no idea who committed the crimes. There is ample evidence that serial killers don't just get bored and start having scruples. Killing is addictive. Once they start, they can't stop. What do you think happened to this Belgium Ripper? The vending machine killer. It was a similar story for cops in Japan, who investigated a case in the 1980s in which 12 people were murdered and 35 more were made seriously ill when a killer put poisoned drinks in the troughs of vending machines. The victims would buy a drink and then discover there were 2 drinks in the trough, possibly believing they'd got 2 for 1. Unbeknownst to the victim, the free one had been laced with dangerous herbicides. This man became known as the vending machine killer. Why he stopped, no one knows. What's worrying is there are copycats in Japan. A new kind of serial killer was born. The New York Times in 1985 quoted a Japanese psychologist who said there was a new breed of thrill-seeking criminal in Japan known as Yukai-Han. The psychologist said they cynically enjoy superiority by imagining the victims groaning and do not feel any remorse. This reminded the Americans of the so-called Tylenol poisonings, in which the killer laced the drug Tylenol with potassium cyanide in various parts of Chicago. 7 people, most of them in their 20s and 30s, all bought spiked Tylenol capsules and died from September to October 1982. In those days, you could just open the bottle and put it back on the shelf. Mary Lynn Reiner bought some regular Tylenol capsules at Frank's Finer Foods, took 2, and fell into a coma. Teresa Janis took 1 pill around dinner time. She told her husband Frank her chest hurt. She was dead just after midnight. No one was ever caught, but what's really disturbing is there were copycats. People saw the news about the murders on TV or read about it in a newspaper, and instead of naturally feeling shocked or upset, they went out and did the same thing. A year later, in 1986, a young woman in Yonkers, New York, took 2 tablets of extra-strength Tylenol that had been laced with cyanide. She died soon after. The New York Times said the FBI had found a second bottle of extra-strength Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide that had been seized from a store in Westchester County. Like the Chicago crimes, no one was ever convicted. Police later said there were hundreds of similar cases throughout the U.S., which led to changes in how Americans took their meds. It might have also inspired the vending machine killer. Again, it is worth noting that there was a significant increase in serial killings when global media exploded right at the time of Jack the Ripper. Sure, there were serial killings in the 17th and 18th centuries, stories, sometimes called vampires or werewolves, but when newspapers took over the world, serial killers got going. The Danilovsky Maniac. Russia's Danilovsky Maniac killed at least 7 people from 2004 to 2007 in the city of Cherepovets in the Vologda Oblast. Despite a massive investigation, no one has ever been caught. Seems the killer had a change of mind, unlikely, or died or went to prison. The Stone Man. Did the Stone Man in India just stop, or did he die or go to prison? In 1989, this guy went up to people sleeping in the street in Calcutta and dropped a massive stone on their heads. The cop said he was probably quite strong since the average stone weight was about 30 kilograms or 66 pounds. There were similar murders in other Indian cities, quite a lot in Mumbai, but no one was ever caught. The Monster of the Mangones. There was a killer in Colombia who was active between 1963 and 1974 and had the whole country in a state of shock. Some people thought stories about him were so far out that he was a myth. He wasn't. This so-called Monster of the Mangones should not have come as much of a surprise. After all, Colombia is infamous for its prolific serial killers. 2 of the most prolific in history are Luis Garavito, aka the Beast, who viciously tortured and killed as many as 300 young men, with 142 convictions in the late 1990s. He really was a beast, the sadist of the highest degree, who often amputated parts of his victims before allowing them to die. Pedro Alonso Lopez, aka the Monster of the Andes, chose girls and young women as his victims, as many as 350 from 1969 to 1980 in various South American countries. But get this, he only spent 14 years in prison in Ecuador and another 4 years in a mental hospital in Colombia. He was released on a $70 bail order in 1998. Lo and behold, he disappeared and didn't see his parole officer again. Interpol and the Colombian National Police now want him in connection with some new murders. As for the Monster of the Mangones, he would shove needles into his male victims' throats and draw out blood. He may have drank the blood, making his murders partly an act of vampirism. He killed up to 38 guys like this and dumped many of their bodies down an alley locally known as the Mangones. Jack the Ripper of Rwanda. We don't have time to cover every country, but we think you need to know about the so-called Jack the Ripper of Rwanda. Rwanda is now an infinitely safer place than it was back in the 90s, when in 94 there was genocide. But in the capital of Kigali, where prostitution is said to be rife, there's a new version of the Ripper. On August 28, 2012, this guy killed 2 sex workers in the poorer part of town in broad daylight. Another woman saw the act, so he killed her too. It's reported he's killed 18 women so far, but what shocked Rwandans the most is on one of the victims' flesh he carved the words, "I will stop once I have killed 400 prostitutes." The New Times of Rwanda said eyewitnesses have seen this guy many times, who's described as a slender, light-skinned man who appears to be in his early 30s. Some people accuse the cops of not looking hard enough given the social standing of the victims. Police responded to these slights by saying the government of Rwanda values every person living in Rwanda regardless of what they do. Police said the reason for the murders is likely conflicts over money and revenge following an HIV/AIDS contamination. 45.8% of sex workers are HIV positive and apparently at the root of the problem. But his criminal profile might also meet the criteria for the missionary killer, a special kind of serial killer who tells himself he's on a mission to exterminate something he feels is evil, dangerous, or just bad. The next story is so horrible it would shock Ted Bundy. The Forest of Horror. In 2014, Nigerian media reported about the Ibadan House of Horror in the city of Ibadan, Oyo State in Nigeria, the country's 3rd largest city. The house had been used for human sacrifices. All around it were buried bodies and body parts in various states of decomposition, including skeletons. Inside the house were 21, maybe 23 victims, many shackled and driven half-mad by despair. The entire area stank of rotting corpses. One Nigerian writer summed it up saying, "No adjective or description is too much to express the horror." A Nigerian newspaper said the police rescued no fewer than 20 corpses and 21 living persons described as lunatics in various horrible health conditions from the scene. The discovery of so many human skulls and the continued exhuming of many more point to the idea that the spot might have existed for a long time. The discovery caused small riots. Families soon asked if their loved ones who'd gone missing had ended up at this horrible house of torture and death. Worse, the Nigerian media and some of the public pointed to wealthy people and even officials and politicians who were accused of hiring kidnappers to find young folks for their sacrifices, which were believed to bring them good fortune. Police still haven't found the culprits, but it's widely believed people of high standing are behind this obscene set of crimes that have gone on for years and possibly claimed hundreds of victims. Some of the victims said, indeed, when they were kidnapped, the people taking them had said they were officials. This case remains a mystery, but according to the press and the public, something stinks to high heaven here. Someone knows more than they're letting on. Now for some killers you might bump into one night on your way home from work. The West Mesa Bone Collector. In 2009, out in the desert of West Mesa in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a woman's dog dug up a bone. It was a human bone. Police got on the case, and soon the remains of 11 women aged between 15 and 32 were found after a crime scene said to be as large as 75 football fields was cordoned off for the dig. It was believed most of the victims were sex workers. One of the victims was 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. A news reporter wrote, "All young women heinously murdered and then deep-sixed into the grit in a forlorn desert." Their families claimed the local police made no effort to find them after they were reported missing. Was this the work of human traffickers, a deranged serial killer, or perhaps drug lords? It was said these women knew each other. They worked the streets and scored drugs in what's sometimes referred to as Albuquerque's war zone. How had they ended up in the ground not far from each other? There have been plenty of suspects, and yet again the case remains open. This next one will chill you to the bone. The Colonial Parkway Killer. You've heard of the Zodiac Killer, but we doubt many of you have heard of the Colonial Parkway Killer. You'll likely recall the movie Zodiac, which shows the Zodiac Killer shooting a couple in a car parked down a lover's lane. This happened in real life. That's what the Colonial Parkway Killer did too, down a dark, mostly deserted road called the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. But he did it to 3 couples, killing them all, while another couple went missing. The murders happened between 1986 and 1989. They might have all been the work of one man, but since the deaths involved strangulation, gunshot, as well as stabbings, they might have also been the work of multiple killers taking advantage of the very dark stretch of road. Then again, in each case, the victims weren't robbed, and each time the killer drove their car away. In the first case in October 1986, the victims were both United States Naval Academy Class of 1981 graduates. Kathy and Becky were a gay couple who at some point during the night must have been approached by a man, perhaps armed with a gun. Both victims were found with rope burns on their wrists and necks. They'd both been slashed so violently that they were almost decapitated. The killer then doused their bodies in gasoline, although he didn't light it. There might be other victims of the same killer not part of his official 8 count, such as 25-year-old Brian Craig Pettinger, who'd been hogtied and thrown into a river while still alive, or 18-year-old Lori Ann Powell Compton, who'd slammed a car door shut on her boyfriend after an argument and walked off into the night, only to be found later with stab wounds in her back. Maybe the killer struck again in 1996. That year, the bodies of 24-year-old Julianne Marie Williams and 26-year-old Laurel Salisbury Winans were discovered. The two had been camping in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park. Like some of the other victims, they were bound and stabbed. Like those other people, the killer wasn't directly sexually motivated. Now for perhaps the strangest case of them all, and arguably the one you should be the most concerned about. All you good-looking sporty types out there, listen carefully. The Smiley Face Killer. The story of the Smiley Face Killer is like a campfire horror tale you tell to your friends. It's a movie, a myth, and yet it might just be real. It's the story of at least 3 dozen young white men who in the 1990s and 2000s, up until the present day, were all found drowned in a body of water. The cases were mysterious, given that the men could swim and no one saw them fall into the water. Some people blamed booze and the hijinks young guys are apt to get up to, but others found the cases very, very strange. 3 dozen mysterious drownings of a similar kinds of young men is a lot, and there might be dozens more. One of the reasons this has been blamed on a serial killer or a group of connected serial killers is the fact that next to or near where the men drowned, there was always a smiley face piece of graffiti drawn on the wall. Something like 45 males have been found dead in the water in 11 states, often seen last at a party or a bar. The smiley face was always nearby. Detectives who worked on the case noted that these men fit a certain kind of profile. They were successful, popular, sporty types, the kind of guys some people might resent. 19 of these dead men were found in just 2 states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, but the detectives believe the killers have struck all over the U.S. One of those detectives said he's sure there's a well-structured, organized gang with cells in major cities across the U.S. who drug, abduct, hold the victims for a period of time before they murder them and then place them in the water. This isn't a joke, they are deadly serious. Some critics of the detective's theory believe the smiley face is so common, it's just a coincidence the men died close to where they were painted. Others have argued that it wasn't always possible to know exactly where the men died. The FBI has said it has no evidence there is a serial killer, stating these instances appear to be alcohol-related drownings. Tell that to the family and friends of a young man named Dakota James, who on December 15, 2016 called his friend Shelly on the phone sometime in the evening. Dakota was in total panic, crying. He told her, "I don't know where I am. I'm so cold. Please help me, I'm lost." He sounded unbelievably desperate. She found him by using a cell phone location app. He was somewhere on Pittsburgh's south side, still in shock. He hardly spoke at first but told her the police had refused to help him. He'd actually asked them for help and they just shrugged him off. Dakota explained to Shelly he'd been at a work Christmas party hosted by the transport company he worked at, and the last time he remembered anything was about 7:15 p.m. 4 hours later, he was walking around Pittsburgh not knowing where he'd been or what he was doing. Shelly thought it might have been a matter of too much booze, or maybe at worst he'd been drugged, but Dakota seemed okay the next day. 5 weeks later, he went missing, and this time Shelly would not get a call. On March 6, 2017, some 40 days later, a woman walking her dog found Dakota bloated and dead in the Ohio River. During the autopsy, the powerful general anesthetic GHB, known as the data salt drug, was found in his system. Did Dakota run into the same people as he did 5 weeks earlier? Had he been stalked? Had he actually been lucky to survive the first attack at his work party? He was young, good-looking, and athletic, the profile that fit the victims of the smiley face killer. His PayPal account had been used just 2 days after he'd vanished. His body certainly had not been in the water for 40 days, according to pathologists, so where had he been for 40 days? Why hadn't he called home? He wouldn't do that kind of thing. His death had been ruled an accident, but a pathologist named Cyril Wecht, who later reviewed his case, said Dakota had ligature marks on his neck. And guess what? On the closest bridge to where he was found, the Roberto Clemente Bridge, there were 11 smiley face symbols spray painted onto the concrete. This bridge was a few miles away, but it was still the closest bridge to where Dakota was found, and where police say he fell in. By now, you guys watching this video understand very well how serial killers copy each other. They watch something on the news and they replicate it. For power, for infamy, to satiate a sick urge. That's what some detectives think has happened here. That in the USA, there were and maybe still are ruthless and brutal people killing for fun and drawing a smiley face near to where they dumped the bodies. Now retired, these detectives say the smiley face killers have murdered around 100 people and they've linked 250 cases to them in total. One of the detectives is so sure of this that he's remortgaged his house and maxed his credit cards trying to solve the case. Both detectives say this depraved gang is highly organized, using various medications on people, stalking them, and choosing a specific target, with each murder being meticulously planned on the dark web. One of the detectives said in an interview in 2019, the level of sophistication of the group is a lot greater than we'd imagined. Now we know they communicate with each other on the dark web. We know there's surveillance and counter-surveillance. Maybe the FBI is right, and there are about 250 murders a year that are the work of American serial killers, or maybe something much darker lurks behind the headlines that we see in our day-to-day media.
A once bullied nerd leaves a toothless head on a golf course. This isn't his only victim, and he gets away with multiple murders for years. A child whose brother was eaten by starving neighbors becomes an almost invisible killer, while another man, a respectable grandfather, would never have been caught had he not once explained what the backside of a human tastes like after 30 minutes in the oven. These men are 7 deadly sinners of the highest degrees, men who would have killed many more people had fate or ego not intervened. Number 7. One of the worst serial killers ever, and certainly one of the strangest, is busy at work in his upper management job at a government office in London. This is always a polite man and is well liked by the staff. And even though he can be quiet at times, he's a conscientious worker and boss. His name is Dennis Nilsen. As evening approaches on February 8, 1983, he has no idea he will soon be explaining how he killed people, many people, and that he often sat with the bodies propped up in the chair as he laughed and joked with the corpse about what he or they were watching on television. He neatly places his pens into his office drawer and announces he's going home, that is, to 23 Cranley Gardens, situated in a leafy suburb in middle-class London. At that moment, he puts on his coat, ready to face the wintry evening, and something strange and perplexing is happening outside his house. He's a clever bloke, Nilsen, there's no doubt about it, but my oh my did he get caught in one of the weirdest ways imaginable. Some say Nilsen's fascination with death and holding on to dead bodies crystallized during his time serving in the army. Some say it went further back to his childhood, and maybe he learned how to get away with murder when he was a cop. But it wasn't until he became a trusted civil servant in the 1970s that he really started to thirst for company. Not so much blood, more for friendships of the dead. Truth be known, he didn't enjoy the killing part. He really didn't enjoy the dissecting and dismembering bit, especially when the bodies were already in terrible states of decomposition. After his one true living love left his life, he started killing for company. In 1978, lonely and depressed but successful at work, he invited a guy back. He waited for him to fall asleep and strangled him. This was at his previous house on Melrose Avenue, number 195, a veritable house of horrors. One trick Nilsen had up his sleeve is that he was an alcoholic, and boy could he drink. He invited more young men back for booze, sometimes just tourists visiting the UK armed with cameras and full of curiosity. Nilsen got them wasted and strangled them. Then they became his friends. He washed their bodies, he stroked them as they lay in bed next to him, he propped them up in chairs and slapped them on the knee when something on the TV made him laugh, treating them like the living. But the problem with bodies is they bloat and they decompose. And Nilsen didn't much like watching Coronation Street with lovers who were stinking and falling apart, so he buried them under the floorboards. He later burned their bodies in the garden near a stack of tires. Local kids used to come around and enjoy what they thought was a nice man having another one of his bonfires. At night, he drank with the dead, and throughout the day, he gave orders in the office. He once explained his routine, saying, "End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person, floorboards back, carpet replaced, back to work." But then he had to move house, and his new place, 23 Cranley Gardens, a lovely-looking 1930s semi-detached with Tudor-style exposed wood on the facade, was a large place but with separate apartments. That meant no place to bury or burn bodies. But as you know, serial killers aren't quitters. They can't quit, and Nilsen kept on killing. This brings us back to the beginning. When Nilsen returned home that evening, he found a drain cleaning company outside his apartment. The other residents complained of often smelling something terrible in the air, and they didn't know where it was coming from. But get this, even Nilsen had complained to the landlord about that. Yeah, go figure. So, a hired drain cleaner named Michael Catron started looking for blockages in the drains, where he too could smell something akin to dead animals. Perhaps he thought a dead rat, but then he pulled out what looked like bits of meat. And that's exactly when Nilsen walked up to him and said the famous words, "It looks to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." But Catron was pretty sure it wasn't chicken. In fact, he thought he found part of an eye, a human eye. He sent what he found off to a pathologist, while Nilsen went up to his flat and went about his life as normal. During the night, he was in his vest as snow fell outside. He was doing a bit of drain cleaning, but there was no way he was getting out of this. The next day, the cops were at the house. It was a human eye. They asked to look inside Nilsen's flat, to which the polite man did not refuse. The place stank. The cops looked startled. Nilsen then pointed to a wardrobe and said, "I think that's what you're looking for." He added calmly, "It's a long story. Goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." After being led out of the house, an investigator asked him how many. Nilsen, again in a calm voice, said 15 or 16 since 1978. There were bits and pieces of bodies all over the house. The police had never seen anything like it. One of them, perplexed later at the station, said, "Why?" Nilsen responded, "I'm hoping you'll tell me that." He killed 12 to 15 people, and the cops were never onto him at any point. Let's remember that many of his victims were young, gay, homeless men. To the police's shame, they were less than caring when those young guys went missing. Had the victims been wealthy, you can be sure the story would be different. And if it weren't for Nilsen's poor choice of flesh disposal, he might have had a lot more dead lovers. He died in prison, 2018, age 72. With this next maniac, his massive ego led the cops to him. Number 6. Bind, torture, kill. That's what this man was known for. The BTK killer confounded cops and made panic pervasive for almost 2 decades in America's Midwest. He later became Dennis Rader, but only after he left many bodies on the streets and had his fun taunting detectives. Again, the classic quiet guy next door who might have tortured animals as a kid and played with himself dressed in stolen panties while peeping through neighbors' windows, but as an adult, he was just another normal-looking family guy. Rader had a degree, he had decent jobs, he married, he had 2 kids. He became president of the church council and was a trusted Boy Scout leader. But my God, was this guy sick in the head. As a child, he kept detective magazines out near his family's chicken house. Magazines that showed women tied up with ropes and knives at their neck. Young Dennis tied himself up and fantasized about killing at the same time. He was just 14. He later admitted even getting turned on by the Rocky and Bullwinkle show when the damsel in distress got tied up on a railway track. And so bondage and torture became the thing for this father of 2. He got away with it time and again, and the cops were for a long time not even close to solving the crimes. That was until 2004, when Rader was pulled over and asked, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" That's when things went wrong for the BTK. a man who thought he couldn't get caught. On January 15, 1974, he murdered a family of 4. They were the Otero family. He first cut all the lines to the house with his murder toolkit, ropes, knife, gun, and he broke into the house. There he found the husband and wife and 2 kids. At gunpoint, he told them they were safe and that he'd soon be gone once he'd gotten what he wanted. He tied them up one by one and killed them all. Rader wasn't just a perverted sadist, he was also a narcissist. That's why he hid a letter in a library detailing what he'd done. It read, in part, "I did it myself with no one's help. The code words will be for me: bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK." In another part of the letter, he tried to explain his madness, saying, "It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversion hang-up. Where this monster enters my brain, I will never know, but it's here to stay." He even talked about his heroes, H.H. Holmes, Jack the Ripper, the Boston Strangler, and other fiends. He killed again in much the same style, and again, this arrogant beast wrote letters. He committed one murder while he was on a Boy Scout trip, being a good role model to boys learning how to tie knots and make fires. Rader had some outdoor skills. Like Nilsson, he'd served time in the military. He'd even won a Good Conduct Medal. He killed another woman named Nancy and another named Shirley. He wrote letters to the cops with the titles "Oh Death to Nancy" and "Shirley Locks." He said in the former letter that he was driven by Factor X, a force only serial killers would understand. A killer who'd frustrated the police just as the Zodiac Killer had done, then just vanished. He'd stay vanished for a long time, but Mr. Rader was not immune to making silly mistakes. As you'll see again today, ego is sometimes the downfall of murderous men. What's dark and unfortunate is that in order to catch a killer, it often requires them to make a mistake. So to get justice, the police in some ways need the killer to strike again. But Rader, he went completely off the radar for many years, so there didn't seem like there was any hope of catching him anymore. In 2004, the BTK became a cold case. But Rader just couldn't stop himself. He sent a newspaper of a photocopy of a driving license of a dead girl. He signed the letter Bill Thomas Killman. Later, he sent more letters and even a puzzle with one of the letters titled The BTK Story, and another along with a package titled The Sexual Thrill Is My Bill. In 2005, he left the cereal box in a pickup truck at a Home Depot. And although the box was thrown away, Rader told the cops what he'd written in another letter. It was then the detectives looked at the CCTV footage in the parking lot. They saw a Jeep Cherokee. He then had the temerity in another letter to ask the cops if they thought it could be traced if he sent them letters on a floppy disk. They replied in a newspaper article in the Wichita Eagle and said no, they couldn't trace that. Rader was no computer scientist, and he didn't know whether there was metadata in the Microsoft Word document he sent them. It revealed the name Dennis and the words Christ Lutheran Church. It didn't take long to find a Dennis Rader who was the president of the church council, and lo and behold, he drove a Jeep Cherokee. DNA did the rest, and Rader went down. In court, his confession was likened to a speech at the Academy Awards. What a narcissist he was. But in the end, his self-adoration put him behind bars. Like Nilsson, he could likely have killed many more and gotten away with it. Now, for a maniac like no other, arguably the sickest man that's ever lived. Number 5. The story of Albert Fish, once heard, can never be forgotten. The story of a seemingly kindly grandpa who committed crimes that would have made Jack the Ripper blush, that might have compelled Ted Bundy to proffer words of concern. He was also another man that thought he was too clever to get caught. Mr. Fish got off on not just inflicting pain on others, but on himself too. When he was arrested, X-rays showed he had a total of 28 needles deeply embedded in his thighs and groin area. Not only that, he often beat himself with a studded paddle and set his nether regions on fire. He claimed to have murdered 100 victims all over the US, but we doubt that's true. Still, he definitely deserved all the monikers he got, which included the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and without a doubt, he was the living version of the Boogeyman. At some point, he developed a liking for human meat, at times feeding himself and his kids on raw meat because that seemed like the closest thing. During this period of his life, he was seen by numerous psychiatric doctors, and all of them said he was sane, despite Fish telling him he had regularly hallucinated. If only they listened to him more. By 1924, still acting like the good dad of 6 kids, his psychosis got to a point that he thought that God was telling him to hurt people, often of a young age. But because he looked like a stable fella, working hard to feed a family, people trusted him. This was at a time when he kept various killing tools which he called his implements of hell. He murdered people in the preceding years, but we only really know about one particular murder. In 1928, he responded to an ad in a newspaper, an ad made by one of the sons of the Budd family. Part of it went, "Young man 18 wishes position in the country." The son wanted work, and Fish, using a fake name, visited the Budd family and regaled them with tales of being a single parent. They liked him, they trusted him. Fish told the son that he had a job for him on his farm in Long Island.
There was no farm. Fish wanted to lure him there and kill him. He did later confess that he intended to bleed the son out. Bud, excited, ran out of the house to buy a new suitcase, while Fish told the parents that his niece was having a birthday party and would like their daughter Grace to attend. Delighted that this man had given their son a job, they said sure, yeah. The last time they saw Grace, she and Fish were holding hands and waving goodbye as they entered the dark mouth of a subway station. It was 6 long years before Mrs. Budd discovered what had happened to her daughter. One day she woke up to find a letter addressed to her. She was illiterate, so she asked one of her sons to read it. Here are some of the parts of possibly one of the worst letters sent in history. My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor. Fish went on to talk about how these people became cannibals and acquired a taste for human flesh, young flesh, according to Fish. This was all fiction, of course. Fish was just being a creative demon. He wrote in another part of the letter, he was roasted in the oven, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed, that kind of thing. Then he talked about his own taste for flesh and the time he invited Grace to his house and fed her strawberries and pot cheese. He said he took her to an empty house and prepared himself while she picked wildflowers without a care in the world. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. You can guess what happened next, especially when we tell you he used the word sweet and tender. He was talking about meat, not personality. The cops were not surprisingly shocked, and even though the part about Hong Kong could not be verified, the part about Grace looked like the truth. But Fish, too confident for his own good, had used an envelope with the letters NYPCBA on it. That stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. The police discovered that the envelope had belonged to a janitor, and he had left it at 200 East 52nd Street after he moved out. The landlady there said another guy had lived there but had just moved out too. His name was Fish. Detective William F. King got on the case and found this Fish guy who pulled out a razor blade after being escorted to the police station. He was easily wrestled to the floor, and not long after in an interview he admitted to killing Grace Budd and other young folk. Subsequent investigations found that Mr. Fish wasn't just a killer, but he was an avowed madman with sadistic impulses. He later admitted to not just killing but mutilating and drinking blood, after which he ate the flesh. That's when a newspaper rightly called him the most vicious killer in criminal history. At the trial, psychiatrists invoked numerous words, isms, and ilias, which most people had probably never heard before. They called him a psychiatric phenomenon, of which he definitely was, but he wasn't insane by the standards of the law. To think he would have gotten away with it had he not written that letter. On January 16, 1936, Fish uttered the words, "I don't even know why I'm here," right before the switch was pulled for the electric chair. Prior to that, he had written a detailed document as to the full extent of his crimes and passed it to his lawyer, James Dempsey. When journalists asked Dempsey about the contents, he replied, "I will never show it to anyone." As you will now see, other maniacs could have gotten away with murder, many more murders in fact, and they would have continued had the cops not been given the facts on a silver platter. Number 4. If ever there was a serial killer who a casting agent would want to play the devil in human form in a movie, it would be the British killer Peter Sutcliffe. Let's now talk about how he got away with killing for so long. The date was July 1979, and a police constable named Andy Laptew had just knocked on the door of a fairly nice-looking semi-detached house in Yorkshire, in the north of England. A woman invited him in for a cup of tea, and her husband Peter joined them. Laptew was one of the many cops who'd been looking for a man who'd been plaguing this part of industrial England for years. The police had so much paperwork for the case that the room where it was kept had to have a reinforced floor so it wouldn't give in to the weight. Somewhere in that paperwork, Sutcliffe's name popped up many times, but the organization was so bad it was hard to connect the dots. But when Laptew spoke to this man, he got a feeling that this could be the guy they were looking for. After all, he was a dead ringer for the police sketches compiled by some survivors of the attacks. When this young officer told his boss about this suspicious man, he received the loud reply, "Anybody mention photo fits to me again will be doing traffic for the rest of their service." After that, Sutcliffe went on killing. His MO was just about always the same. He'd sneak up behind a woman at night and bash them over the head with a hammer. After that, he often went to work with a knife, hence he got the name the Yorkshire Ripper. The women were often poor, with some of them selling their bodies on the streets in some of England's most run-down areas of Leeds and Bradford, places that looked as though they belonged not in wealthy England but some of the poorest places on the planet. This is one of the reasons why the cops were later criticized. Had the victims been well off, perhaps they'd have felt more pressure to solve the case. In truth, they tried hard, but their minds and investigation techniques were old.
The case ruined not just the victims' lives and their families' lives, but it made the hardworking investigators so ill, some of them died from stress-related illness way before their time. Still, when at first it seemed as though the Ripper was only killing prostitutes, the cops seemed less than compassionate. When it seemed Sutcliffe had killed the first woman who wasn't a prostitute, unbelievably the cops issued a statement saying that the Ripper is now killing innocent girls. They were all innocent, of course, but that statement shows how the cops felt and how out of date their thinking was. As the years passed, more and more women were being found with similar injuries, but the police didn't always connect the killings. They had an innumerable amount of survivors coming forward, some stating this man had a definite Yorkshire accent and that he had dark hair with a dark beard. They actually interviewed Sutcliffe 9 times during the long investigation, but he was let go each time. After all, he was a working man with a wife and they shared a nice house. He didn't look like a killer. As you now know, it can literally be a fatal mistake to discount people who don't look like killers. Serial killers will look like you, like me, like your neighbor, and like your boss. Then in 1977, Sutcliffe made his fatal mistake. He was already many victims in, so this time he decided to choose the city of Manchester for his next killing, about a 45-minute drive from Bradford. He killed her, mutilated her, and left the scene. But later, he realized he'd given this woman a £5 note for services that were never rendered. Furious with himself, he drove back to this bit of wasteland to retrieve the note. When he couldn't find it, in anger, he almost took the head off of her with a spanner. Knowing how mean the streets were, the clever woman had hidden the note in a secret compartment in her purse. But the cops found it. Tracking a note isn't easy, as you would guess, and it took some pretty amazing police work to eventually find out that that note had been paid to someone who worked at a T&WH Clark Holdings, where Sutcliffe had a job as a driver. He was interviewed like all the staff, and when police interviewed him again at his house, his wife lied and gave him an alibi for the night of the murder. She didn't actually know about his extramarital murderous activities. Then the cops received a tape recording in the post. It read, "I'm Jack. I see you're having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you're no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." George was the lead investigator, a man who'd soon die from stress, but George was stubborn and he was convinced that the guy on the tape was the killer even though his accent was not from Bradford or even close by. The man was a hoaxer, and he later sent a letter to a newspaper that read, "I am the Ripper. I've been dubbed a maniac by the press, but not by you. You call me clever, and I am. You and your mates haven't a clue that the photo in the paper gave me fits." Even the FBI's behavioral unit, who literally invented criminal profiling, went over to England and said that man is not the killer. But those Yorkshire cops kept looking for the man who'd been dubbed Wareside Jack due to his accent, while Sutcliffe murdered more women. Then the unbelievable happened. Even in a case already implausibly bad, one of Sutcliffe's buddies, who long suspected his friend was the Yorkshire Ripper, sent a letter to the police. It was marked Priority Number 1, and it read, "I have good reason to know the man you are looking for in the Ripper case. This man has dealings with prostitutes and always had a thing about them. His name and address is Peter Sutcliffe, 5 Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford, Shipley." Remember, the police had already interviewed Sutcliffe 9 times and had been to that house. He looked almost identical to the man in the sketches, and he had a Yorkshire accent just as some survivors had said. For Pete's sake, he even worked where the note came from. That friend even went to the police station soon after to say what he knew verbally, but it seems he was ignored again to the cops' utter discredit. That talk he had at the police station, which must have been noted in the station files, seemed to have not happened. The police later said all the evidence of the chat had somehow disappeared. And so Sutcliffe was preparing himself to kill again. He couldn't believe his luck, even though he just killed a woman with a hammer and severely mutilated her. That murder had not even been connected to the other murders in Bradford. It was a carbon copy in a city that didn't have many murders. Sutcliffe thought he could just keep doing this forever. He later said God must have been helping him, but no, it was just shoddy police work. He killed again, even after being charged with a DUI. He then attacked a woman studying at Leeds University who'd been so scared she slept with a knife under her bed. Sutcliffe's buddy died from a heart attack, so he wasn't alive to hear that on January 2nd, 1981, a man had been pulled over in the city of Sheffield, not far from Bradford. It was just a routine stop at a police check, but the guy that stopped him was still in police training. He soon discovered that Sutcliffe's car had a fake license plate. It was then recalled that this guy looked a bit like those sketches he'd seen in the newspapers. Sutcliffe then said he needed to pee, and so before the cop took him in for further questioning, he was allowed to go for one. There, out of the view of the officer, he threw things over a wall: a knife, a hammer, and some rope. In the police station, they had no idea they had the Ripper, and Sutcliffe was sent to a holding cell without being searched. He not only had another knife on him, but he was wearing a V-neck sweater on his legs, a kind of undergarment that gave easy access to his private parts for when he killed. The next day, the cops went back to the scene after the constable had told the peeing story.
They found the evidence and were soon interrogating Sutcliffe. He held out for a bit, but cracked in the end, saying, "The women I killed were filth. I was just cleaning up the place a bit." In court, it was incredible that the judge said this. While some of the victims were prostitutes, perhaps the saddest part of this case is that some were not. The last 6 attacks were on totally respectable women. Sutcliffe went to prison and then to Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital, a place where he was viciously attacked and lost sight in one eye after someone put a pin through it. He was attacked more times after that. He lasted until 2020 when he died of heart conditions as well as COVID. This next killer is straight from hell, and likely one of the most terrifying people you've never heard of. Number 3. On the morning of March 13, 2012, 2 Texas police officers go over to a man in a parking lot at a cafe in Lufkin, Texas. It's still early in the day, and it's a fairly routine stop after the guy had been seen driving a bit erratically. But little do those cops know that the man they're talking to is one of the vilest, unforgiving creatures that has ever been put in this sometimes wicked world. It will take a long time for them to figure it out, and not without the killer's help. His name is Israel Keyes. This is a man that tortured and terrorized, a man that was so unrepentant that he despised other serial killers that had apologized for their crimes. When your idol as a teenager is Ted Bundy, there sure is a problem. The term evil personified springs to mind, and it is only by chance that this evil was contained when it was. He started killing in 1998. He did his stint in the army and then started killing again. He had one thing on his mind while driving all over the US, robbing stores and burglarizing houses. That was murder, or what he called hunting. He often chose isolated areas to pick his victims, with campgrounds being one of his favorite places. And when you drive from one side of the US to the other and pick a few people from campgrounds, well, that makes the job of law enforcement pretty darn hard. When he brutally murdered Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont in 2011, he made sure their bodies were never found. According to Keyes, he shot the man and strangled the woman. He bought weapons all over the country, and when he bought chemicals to get rid of the bodies, he also bought them in locations far and wide. He paid only in cash, and he often kept his phone turned off. So how do you catch a man like this? Even one who is robbing banks and breaking into people's houses numerous times. No sooner than he committed a crime, he became a ghost. But at some point, he had to make a mistake. On February 1st, 2012, a young woman named Samantha Koenig was just finishing up her shift at Common Grounds coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, when a man walked in waving a gun. She did as told and handed him the cash, but Keyes had more on his mind than money. He took her out to his Ford Focus at gunpoint, her hands now zip-tied, and she fought and struggled, but with sharp warnings about the gun being used, she had no choice but to comply. And anyway, Keyes assured her that she wouldn't get hurt, that he was only after a little ransom money. At some point, he drove back to the coffee place to pick up her phone. Keyes then told her to send a message to her boyfriend. It read, "Hey, I'm spending a couple days with friends, let my dad know." Later, Keyes went to her house to get her credit card. That credit card, Keyes knew, was in the boyfriend's car, and so when he went to get it, the boyfriend saw him. Instead of confronting Keyes, the boyfriend went inside and called the cops. Keyes returned to his home, where he eventually strangled Koenig. Calmly, he drank some wine and then made some notes about his upcoming cruise ship trip close to New Orleans. He woke his daughter up and they went to the airport. The cops knew someone had used that bank card, but that guy was on the move, and strangely, even though they had a video from when Keyes took the girl from the coffee place, they wouldn't release it. 7 days after the abduction, news website in Alaska wrote this: Anchorage police say showing the video now would be purely for entertainment because besides containing evidence that could be used in a courtroom, they say the video shows nothing that would help them solve the crime. But as he'd committed numerous murders, bank robberies, and burglaries, surely they must have had a face on file that looked similar. Surely someone in the public would have recognized Keyes. Possibly, but in a book about Keyes called American Predator, the writer says it's possible that Keyes once went to Mexico for plastic surgery. He might also have removed the skin on the tips of his fingers. After his cruise was over, Keyes went back to Alaska with only a bit of cash in his pocket. He made a decision and applied makeup to the now dead body of Koenig. To ensure her eyes stayed open, he tied the lids with fishing line. After that, he took a picture of her and sent out a ransom note. To make it look real, he placed a new copy of Anchorage Daily News beside the body. Soon after, he chopped her up and threw the parts in a lake. He later drew money from Koenig's account in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, but when in Arizona, he was caught on camera. So when those 2 cops pulled him over in Texas, they had a guy fitting the description of the kidnapper. Sometime later, CBS News wrote, investigators believe Samantha died within hours of her abduction. The article also said investigators further believe the person responsible for Samantha's death acted alone, and we're confident that we have that person in custody. But at this point, those investigators really had no idea who they had on their hands. They thought Keyes was an idiot who'd messed up kidnapping. They had no idea he was a serial killer. He ended up telling the cops about his other murders, explaining that doing the deeds so far and wide made him virtually undetectable.
In 2012, he was found dead in his cell. Close to his body lay a piece of writing titled Ode to Murder. Some of it went like this: "The reality is you were just bones and meat, and with your brain died also your soul. Your wet lips were a promise of a secret unspoken nervous laugh as it burst like a pulse of blood from your throat. There will be no more laughter here." Yeah, this guy wasn't exactly a bag of laughs. But how many people did he really kill? It's hard to say, but investigators found a pentagram drawn next to 11 skulls in his cell. Under the drawing were the words "We are one." Those 11 skulls, maybe they meant 11 victims. And let's be honest here, before that kidnapping, police had no idea who he really was, even after all the confirmed robberies. His name had popped up only in Washington state for the offenses of driving without a valid license and a separate DUI. Now for a disturbing case of a man who really knew how to get rid of a body, even though he was bullied all his school life because of his learning difficulties. Number 2. Viewers, don't ever bully people. It's always wrong. It's the jurisdiction of the stupid. And you never know if that person whose life you made a misery might one day put the head of a woman inside a paint can and leave it lying on a golf course. You could really put someone off their game by doing that. A head in a can would usually be pretty useful to the cops, but not when all the teeth have been meticulously pulled out, and not when the legs for that head are lying miles away and the torso and arms are swimming down a river somewhere. When all that happens, as did happen in this case, the pieces might not be put together for 24 years, and even then, the perpetrator had to lend a helping hand. On February 20th, 1989, this guy committed his first murder, and his victim was Heidi Balk. When she was killed at the age of 25, she'd been working as a prostitute in the Manhattan area of New York City. Sometime later, as you know, her head was found on a golf course stuffed inside a paint can. One of the cops that worked on the case, not surprisingly, said it was shocking. The cop also said as the years passed, they never thought they'd arrest someone for the crime. This guy had gone to great lengths not to get caught, so despite his learning disabilities, he was certainly what detectives called forensically aware. His name was Joel Rifkin. Had he not told the police that he killed this girl and killed many others, he'd still likely be known to few friends as merely an oddball who wasn't very charismatic when it came to the opposite sex. This troubled and sexually frustrated young man might have killed up to 17 women, many of them prostitutes. Unfortunately, sometimes when the poor and most vulnerable people on this planet get murdered, there's not always the most energetic police response. That's why there's a theory of what's called less dead people, meaning such folks don't mean as much in life, and so in death they are less dead. Rifkin would almost certainly not have gotten away with murdering 17 middle-class students in New York, but to be fair to the police, he was also very good at not leaving clues. When he murdered Balk by hitting her over the head and strangling her, he then used an X-Acto knife to remove her fingertips on top of throwing her dismembered arms in the East River. Taking out her teeth was also a testament to his forensic awareness. Soon after, when he killed another prostitute, Julie Blackbird from Long Island, not only did he do the dismembering, but he weighed the body parts down with concrete and threw them in a canal. He kept killing this way, mostly prostitutes or drug-addicted people whose existences were tenuous to say the least. One addict, 28-year-old Lorraine Orvieto, was killed by Rifkin and then stuffed into an oil drum and dumped in Coney Island Creek. She was found by a fisherman, but notably her family took 2 months to even tell the cops their daughter was missing. It seems she was less dead to her family too. In June 1993, Rifkin strangled a prostitute named Tiffany Bresciani. He proceeded to drive her body back to where his mother lived to presumably take her apart. On the way, he stopped at a hardware store and picked up some serial killer necessities, tarp and rope. He then made the rookie mistake of leaving her body in a wheelbarrow in the garage for 3 days in the summer heat, which, as you will know, will speed up the decomposition process and create quite the stink. With that malodor starting to perfuse the nearby area, Mr. Rifkin decided it was time to make a move. He got in the car and started driving to an area which he knew was an excellent spot to dump a dead prostitute, but again he'd made the rookie mistake, especially for a man who'd become an accomplished killer. He drove in a car with a missing license plate, which for a serial killer is tantamount to the folly of a politician opening his mouth and speaking his mind. When Rifkin was spotted by state troopers Deborah Spergarin and Sean Ruin, and those blue and white started flashing, he knew he couldn't stop because he'd allowed that body to progress to putreficative stinkiness. At first he didn't speed up, but he didn't stop either. A high-speed chase ensued, which ended with Rifkin and his eternally quiet passenger being wrapped around a utility pole right outside a courthouse. When the cops ran over to the wreck, guns in hand, before they could even assess the damage, they smelled the familiar odor of a dead person. Rifkin was subsequently questioned at the station, and in time, he just told the cops everything, stuff they had no idea about. He even drew them maps so they know how to find the bodies or body parts. Some Jane Does finally got a name. Although the head in the can on the golf course was named Susie, her working name, and the name she'd given Rifkin, It wasn't until 2013 that she became Heidi Balk. In 1994, Rifkin met another killer in prison named Colin Ferguson, a man who opened fire at a train in 1993 with the intent of killing white folks. He shot 25 and killed 6. Close to the prison telephones, they both started arguing over who was the better killer, and with 17 bodies to his name and an exemplary background in body disposal, no doubt Rifkin got the upper hand in that debate. But his troubles with other prisoners in the end meant solitary confinement. Presently, he's at Clinton Correctional Facility. He's due to see a parole board in the year 2197. Number 1. Okay, the last one. This is a very original story of how killers get away with murder. The killer's name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was arguably Russia's worst serial killer, although the killer cop Mikhail Popkov and the infamous chessboard killer might have something to say about that. Chikatilo possessed a rage from hell. He did indescribable things to his victims. He was Monster Incorporated and he got away with it for years. He really shouldn't have, given that when he was a young man it was obvious he was a fiend. He was impotent from a young age and some girls mocked his non-working member. This shame manifested into rage, and the angry young man groped his way through university while being roundly reviled. When he later taught Russian literature, he was a creep who groped his own students. He spied on young women, watching them from a distance as something stirred in his loins. He acted on that as well many times and was so removed from schools. If he started at another school, he did the same again. You might wonder, how did he even get another job? Well, the reason is connected to why he got away with so many murders. At the time, the Soviet Union and the Soviet education system didn't want to admit such criminals could come through the system, so it denied the wrongs that this man committed. And even when he started killing, detectives didn't look at a literature teacher. Former academics didn't mutilate people and rip parts off them with their teeth even when the victim was still breathing. Only wild animals did that. Sometimes these bodies were literally torn to pieces, which is why the killer became known as the Rostov Ripper. Chikatilo had by this point become a traveling businessman, which is an ideal job for a serial killer since bodies far from each other in a massive country like Russia can't easily be connected, even when they did start turning up in numbers, with utterly disturbing crime scenes. Moscow didn't want to admit Russia had a serial killer. It said that kind of thing only happens in the decadent West. But bodies kept piling up and Moscow had to face the truth. Soon there were hundreds of cops after this killer, many hanging around train stations where the majority of victims had gone missing. Operations happened where undercover cops were stationed on trains and around railway depots, but Chikatilo kept killing pretty much under their noses. One time he was spotted by an undercover cop at Donetsk station right after he'd murdered a woman. The cop asked him what those stains were on his clothes, to which Chikatilo replied that he was a mushroom forager. Huh, thought the cop, a mushroom forager with a nice duffel bag. It didn't make sense. But it was only by sheer luck that when another cop was looking at the names of men who'd been questioned, he actually noticed the name Chikatilo. He recalled seeing the name before, back in the day, related to a missing person. But this time, unlike the other times, the cop dug deeper. And guess what he found? He discovered that this traveling businessman had been kicked out of numerous schools in the past for sexually motivated crimes. He then saw Chikatilo's name had popped up again when there'd been a sexual and violent crime. No one had joined these dots in years, and now they seemed to form a picture of a violent, murderous maniac. Chikatilo was last put under some serious surveillance, and even though they arrested him right before he was about to commit another murder, under questioning he never cracked, and the cops really didn't have much hard evidence. He might not have done 1 year in prison had something strange not happened next. Police did something that had not ever happened in the Soviet Union. Instead of grilling him again, they called in a psychiatrist named Alexander Bukhanovsky. It was this guy that once rightly told them you were looking for an educated man, a sadist, who is likely impotent and hates women. Now the cops knew he was right, so gave him a bit more credit to the art of understanding the motivation of a madman. Bukhanovsky sat in front of Chikatilo and told him what he'd suspected, that he was a sad, lonely man, a man with a terrible childhood, a boy who'd been traumatized. Bukhanovsky didn't know right then that the Chikatilo family literally starved in famine, and his own brother was killed and cannibalized by neighbors, after which the mother blamed the bedwetting murderer-to-be. Childhood could not have been any worse by any human standards, and when the psychiatrist said this to Chikatilo, by the time the doctor was done, Chikatilo, now in tears, said, "It was me, I did it, I killed them all." He told the police not only about the murders they'd been investigating, but about many other murders they didn't even know happened. Then on October 15, 1992, Chikatilo was sentenced to death for 52 murders. On February 14, 1994, a bullet to the back of his head ended his life. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison. It's no secret that our society has a fascination with serial killers. We pore over every last detail of their heinous crimes, soak up the stories of their captures and convictions, even rejoice when they meet their end. We just can't get enough of serial killers, even going so far as to wonder about things like, what did famous serial killers eat for their last meal? From the grossly gluttonous to the downright bizarre, the final meals of some of the world's most infamous killers is sure to surprise you. Delbert Teague Jr. On a quiet April night in 1985, Donna Irwin and her boyfriend Tommy Cox were enjoying a private romantic evening at a scenic lookout near Fort Worth, Texas, when their lives were turned upside down. Delbert Teague Jr. and an accomplice cornered the unsuspecting couple, tied Tommy up and robbed him of $80 before they forced Donna into their vehicle and took off. Moments later, another truck arrived and Tommy, who had gotten free of his bonds, approached it begging for help. Suddenly, Teague and his accomplice returned to the scene and opened fire on the occupants, who had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time. All three men were shot with a .22 pistol, and Kevin Allen was killed. Teague once again fled the scene with Donna in tow, and over the next several days proceeded to drive hundreds of miles, crossing state lines with his captive, while repeatedly sexually assaulting her. After Donna left a hastily scrawled note behind in a rest stop bathroom, the police tracked down Teague, and after a dramatic 100-mile-per-hour chase, they finally captured him and freed Donna. This wasn't Teague's only brush with the law. He had previously been convicted of robbery, forgery, and weapons charges, and had even served 2 years for involuntary manslaughter. At his trial, prosecutors called him a one-man slaughterhouse before he was convicted and sentenced to death. Teague initially refused to order a special meal, but his grieving mother requested that he be given a cheeseburger, which he begrudgingly ate to please her before going to his death. Turns out even hardened criminals are no match for their moms. If only the next killer had such a strong-willed parental figure, he might have had a better last meal. David Edwin Mason. Over a chaotic 9-month period in 1980, David Edwin Mason beat and strangled to death 4 defenseless elderly victims in their own homes before robbing them. It's likely that Mason knew many of his victims personally, having previously been hired by them to do odd jobs around their homes. At the time of his arrest, Mason was also wanted for shooting his male lover to death as he slept. And his violent spree didn't stop after he was apprehended. While in jail awaiting trial, he and another inmate beat Mason's cellmate and strangled him to death with a garrote made of a knotted towel, before hanging the battered body in a shower in a feeble attempt to make it look like a suicide. Mason also had a violent past. He had previously been convicted of robbery, assault, and weapons charges, and had even shown violent tendencies as a child, assaulting other school kids, threatening his brother with a knife, setting fires, and self-harming. His parents responded with harsh discipline, bordering on abuse, but surprisingly, it didn't seem to help. After his conviction, Mason waived all of his appeals and requested a quick execution, which he was granted, and he was gassed to death at San Quentin in 1993. He refused a last meal, instead asking for just a glass of ice water before he faced the gas chamber. Mason may have gone to his death with nothing but ice water in his stomach, but this next murderer must have had ice in her veins. Carla Faye Tucker. After a wild night of partying, Carla Faye Tucker had an idea. She decided it was the perfect time to head to the apartment of one Jerry Dean to collect some money that he owed her and to intimidate him a little. Tucker would end up doing much more than intimidating him. After breaking in with a stolen key, Tucker approached Dean as he slept in his bed and put a pickaxe to his head. As he awoke and began to beg for his life, Tucker struck him in the head with the axe. A witness would later testify that he saw Tucker pull the axe out of a body and smile maniacally to herself before hitting it again with enthusiasm. In all, Tucker would strike Dean 28 times with the pickaxe, and she would later tell investigators that each blow gave her a thrill of sexual satisfaction. Tucker also killed Deborah Thornton, who was in bed with Dean, and she was captured by the police a few days later, convicted and sentenced to death. In prison, Tucker gained national attention for her outgoing personality and her conversion to born-again Christianity. Popular televangelist Pat Robertson even campaigned unsuccessfully for her sentence to be commuted to life in prison. Before Tucker made history as the first woman to be executed in Texas since 1863, and the second woman executed in the entire U.S. since the 1976 reinstatement of the death penalty, she feasted on a final meal of fresh salad, a ripe peach, and a single banana. It's nice to know that there are vegetarian-friendly options on death row. But you won't believe what our next killer requested off the plant-based menu. In the summer of 1960, drifter Victor Fager was staying at a decrepit boarding house when he called Dr. Edward Bartles, claiming that a woman there desperately needed medical help. When Dr. Bartles arrived, Fager kidnapped him and later killed him with a gunshot to the head. Authorities believe that Fager was after the doctor's drugs and that he had picked Dr. Bartles at random out of the Yellow Page listings. He was the last person to be executed in Iowa and the last person executed in the entire U.S. for the next 40 years. The night before he was set to die by hanging, Fager held an all-night vigil with a Catholic priest, and for his last meal he requested a single olive with the pit left in. He believed the pit would grow into an olive tree inside of his dead body and be a symbol of peace. If Fager's idea of a peaceful last meal doesn't exactly appeal to you, then our next criminal's final indulgence might be a little more up your alley. Timothy McVeigh. On the morning of April 9, 1995, just moments after parents had finished dropping off their children at the Murrah Federal Building's on-site daycare, downtown Oklahoma City was rocked by a giant explosion. A rental truck stuffed with explosives had been parked outside of the building, and the blast destroyed half of the 9-story building, injuring 450 people, killing 168, including 19 small children. Army vet Timothy McVeigh was captured by police just hours later and convicted of the horrific crime. The bombing took place on the second anniversary of the fire at David Korsh's Waco compound, and McVeigh's rage toward the government for that event, plus the earlier siege on Randy Weaver, had stoked McVeigh's hatred toward the government and prompted him to commit the worst domestic terrorist attack in American history. He remained unrepentant until the very end, claiming that the U.S. government were the true terrorists and stating that even before his execution the score would still be 168-1, leaving him victorious. Before McVeigh became the first person to be executed in the U.S. in the 40 years since Fager's execution, he gorged himself on 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. If ice cream is the last meal of choice for the man who killed hundreds, what would the person who killed millions want for their final meal? You might be surprised. Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Nazis' final solution, was one of the most notorious war criminals in history. After the end of World War II, Eichmann managed to evade capture and escape to Argentina, a country known for its hesitancy to deport war criminals, where he settled down with his family and lived comfortably for decades. That is, until a group of Israeli operatives daringly kidnapped Eichmann outside of his home and spirited him to Israel to account for his crimes. His April 1961 trial, featuring harrowing testimonies from Holocaust survivors, was widely publicized and was a major force in bringing the true scale of the Nazis' atrocities to light for the general public. Eichmann claimed to have been nothing but a cog in the Nazi machine, but the evidence showed that he had been responsible for the Nazis' mass deportation of Jews to ghettos and killing centers, having designed the entire system down to the last details himself, and personally profiting from the confiscation of Jewish assets. Eichmann was found personally responsible for the deaths of millions of European Jews, and before he was executed by hanging on June 1, 1962, more than 2 decades after the end of the war, he requested a final bottle of red wine as his last meal. Alcohol might be the obvious choice for the last meal, but what would a killer with less refined tastes want? You're about to find out. John Wayne Gacy. By all appearances, John Wayne Gacy was a model citizen, beloved by his community for his volunteer work, and known for dressing up as a clown to entertain local children. But Gacy, who would come to be known as the Killer Clown, had a dark side. In 1978, a young man disappeared after meeting with Gacy about a construction job, prompting authorities to search Gacy's unassuming suburban home. What they uncovered was a real-life house of horrors. Beneath the floorboards were the lime-covered bodies of 29 of Gacy's victims, and he would later admit to having thrown the bodies of 4 more victims into a nearby river. Gacy was convicted of the brutal murder of 33 young men and boys, and in 1980 he was sentenced to death. For his last meal, the one-time manager of a KFC restaurant that was owned by his former father-in-law requested a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken original recipe, a side of fries, and a pound of fresh strawberries. Apparently, the guards never did confirm to Gacy that the chicken actually came from KFC, so at least he went to the grave with that nagging question unanswered. Gacy's greasy last meal seems fitting for such a disgusting monster, but it has to make you wonder, what would the world's most charming serial killer want for his final feast? Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a handsome, charming law student, but he was also living a horrifying double life. The seemingly clean-cut Bundy had been raping and murdering women all over the U.S. for years, first charming them into his vehicle before brutally raping and murdering them and then callously disposing of their bodies. Bundy also managed to charm his way out of more than a few close calls before he was finally caught. He was first arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping when the police found handcuffs in his car, but the clever killer would escape from custody not once, but twice. After his second escape, he fled to Florida, where he managed to evade capture for weeks. While on the run, he viciously attacked 5 college students, brutally beating them with a blunt instrument and strangling and killing 2 of them. 2 weeks later, he assaulted and murdered a 12-year-old girl. He was finally recaptured when he was caught by police in a stolen car and convicted of murdering the 3 Florida women, though he would later go on to confess to having raped and killed more than 30 women in Colorado, Oregon, Utah, Florida, and Washington. Before he was sent to face his death, Bundy refused to make a special request for his last meal, so he was given the standard final meal at a Florida state prison: a medium-rare steak, eggs over easy, toast with butter and jelly, milk, coffee, juice, and hash browns. He didn't need a single bite. From ice water to olive pits, fried food to 4-course meals, learning what famous serial killers ate as their last meal is morbidly fascinating, to say the least. So now that you know what the likes of Adolf Eichmann and Ted Bundy chose for their final meal before facing their deaths, we have to ask you, what would you eat for your last meal? Some prisoners ask for forgiveness, some just say a prayer. But for these killers, their legacy of evil continued to their dying breath. Here are 15 murderers' chilling final words. Number 15. John Wayne Gacy. A lot's been said about this infamous killer clown. We've said a lot of it. A terrifying predator before he even began killing, Gacy never showed remorse for any of the lives he ruined, including the 33 lives he took, 26 of which he buried on his property. Instead, he was defiant all the way to the execution chamber. To his lawyer, he accused the state of committing murder by executing him. And to the public, he had one last message before lethal injection: kiss my ass. No thank you. At number 14, H.H. Holmes. America's first superstar serial killer, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, most of them committed between 1891 and 1894 in his murder castle, a self-designed house of horrors made with the sole purpose of trapping, torturing, and killing his victims. At his execution, Holmes was calm, telling the hangman, in what would be his last words, "Take your time, old man, don't bungle it." Once the trap was sprung, instead of the noose breaking his neck, Holmes slowly strangled to death for 15 minutes. He took his time, all right. Gacy's last message was blunt. Holmes was prescriptive, but at least both were intelligible. Unlike number 13, Eileen Wuornos. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos shot and killed 7 men. The body of one of them has still never been found. Wuornos, a sex worker, at first claimed she acted in self-defense, then claimed robbery as the motive. As she went in for lethal injection in October 2002, she said, "I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like in the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back. I'll be back." Yeah, her last message on Earth was a reference to the 1996 Will Smith blockbuster. A less prolific but no less deadly femme fatale is our number 12, Mary Percy. Percy lived with her lover, James Hogg, but he married his other girlfriend, Phoebe Styles, after she got pregnant. Percy apparently became jealous once Phoebe actually gave birth. On October 24, 1888, she invited Phoebe and the baby over for tea, and they didn't leave alive. Phoebe's body had been thrown out with the trash, nearly decapitated. Her baby was found smothered. It didn't take long for the police to connect them to Percy. When they went to her house, they found the walls, ceiling, and some clothes, and a knife all spattered with blood. Not only that, Percy was wearing Phoebe's ring when the police arrested her. She remained defiant all the way to the hangman's noose. Her final words, "My sentence is a just one." But a good deal of the evidence against me was false. Many believe Mary Percy was also Jack the Ripper, but that's a story for another day. Another killer making excuses is number 11, Francis Two Gun Crowley. Crowley was known for his hatred of police, especially after his criminal brother was killed in an altercation. In 1931, he went on a crime spree that included vandalism, breaking and entering, attempted murder, auto theft, bank robbery, and disposing of a dead body. When the two cops approached Crowley in the street, merely asking for identification, he shot both, killing one of them. He then barricaded himself in an apartment building and exchanged gunfire with police for 2 hours. Crowley finally had given up when he approached the electric chair on January 21, 1932. He only had this to say: "This is what I get for defending myself." Not every killer gets to speak their final words out loud. That was the case with number 10, Fred West. A real sicko, Fred and his wife Rose together murdered a number of young women, including their 15-year-old daughter, over a period of 15 years. When the evil couple was finally arrested, Rose told the public not only that she was innocent, but she hated Fred. The betrayal broke Fred. Before they could even go to trial, he hung himself, leaving behind a final desperate message scrawled on a drawing of a tombstone. "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West, rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." Nothing about their victims, which also included Fred's ex-wife and a daughter from that first marriage, just a tribute to their unholy matrimony. Some couples just tend to bring out the worst in each other. At number 9, Robert Charles Comer, whose last words at execution reference neither his crimes nor his companion, Javenna Willis.
Comer and Willis went on a night-long spree of kidnapping and murder in 1987. At an Arizona campground, Comer and Willis invited another camper to their tent for dinner. Comer shot and stabbed their guest, then stole a number of his belongings, including a dog, which Comer later killed. They then went to another site, kidnapping a young couple at gunpoint. The two were forced into the back of their truck, which Comer drove while Willis followed behind. They left the boyfriend in the woods, and the woman eventually made her escape and ran to the nearest sheriff. When caught by police, the criminal couple were suddenly not so devoted. In exchange for a lighter sentence, Willis testified against Comer, who was executed by lethal injection in May 2007. Instead of repentance or even bitterness about being betrayed, his last words were a tribute to the California Bay Area where he grew up. Go Raiders! Our number 8, Barbara Graham. Barbara Graham was the female member of a gang of criminals. They targeted an older woman rumored to have hidden a secret fortune in her house. On March 9, 1953, Graham arrived at the woman's doorstep claiming car trouble. When the door was opened for her to use the phone, Graham's 4 conspirators made their way inside. With the victim tied and gagged, they ripped the place apart to no avail. The rumors were just that, and they could find nothing of real value. According to Graham's accomplices, that's when she turned on the woman, beating her to death. At trial, Graham insisted she was innocent. Her credibility was shattered when an undercover cop secretly recorded her trying to pay someone to provide her with an alibi, during which she admitted she was at the scene of the crime. Graham and 2 of the other gangsters were sentenced to death. She insisted on her innocence all the way to the gas chamber, where she gave this final defeated message: "Good people are always so sure they're right." There are still people who believe that Graham might have been innocent of the murder, if not the robbery. At number 7, Clarence Ray Allen. Allen plotted and executed the robbery of Fran's Market, a grocery store owned by acquaintances of his. After the robbery, his son's girlfriend, Mary Sue Kitts, revealed his involvement to the grocery store owner's son. Allen convinced one of his accomplices from the robbery to murder Mary Sue. The accomplice confessed years later, leading to Allen's arrest. He then convinced a cellmate about to be paroled to kill all the surviving witnesses for him. His hitman carried out the first hit but was soon caught with the hit list still on him. Allen received the death penalty in 1982. He's also suspected of killing an entire family in Chino Hills. Despite his lawyers appealing against the death penalty, citing his old age, lawmakers pointed out that since he contracted kills while in prison, he was a danger as long as he lived. While in prison, Allen embraced his Native American heritage. His mother was part Choctaw, his father part Cherokee. His final statement was a quotation of the Lakota battle cry, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die." Our number 6, William Bonin, was philosophical as he reached the gas chamber in 1996. Bonin was one of 3 separate serial killers known as the Freeway Killer. Bonin was tried for killing 12 people in Los Angeles County and another 4 in Orange County between 1979 and 1980. It's believed he actually murdered at least 21 people, all young men between the ages of 13 and 19. Bonin tortured his victims before killing them, and even recruited 4 young accomplices, most of them also teenagers. The deliberate, drawn-out nature of his crimes made his final statement before lethal injection all the odder. I would advise that when a person has thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did it, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously. Then, Governor Pete Wilson said Bonin's death was a more pleasant one than he gave any of his victims. Number 5, Andre Chikatilo is one of the most prolific serial killers of all time, earning him the name the Red Ripper. Successfully convicted of 52 murders committed between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo claimed his actual count was 57, and he was suspected of even more. The bodies of many of his victims were misused by him after death. Despite being dismissed by the judge at his trial as not being crazy, Chikatilo apparently felt there was still something exceptional about his mind. At his execution in 1994, his final words, "Don't blow my brains out, the Japanese want to buy them," a request that was denied. A single bullet was fired into the back of the Red Ripper's head. James French at number 4 was one killer who knew his last words could make the papers. That's why he gave his last words twice. French was an eager killer who couldn't wait to be executed. In 1958, French received a life sentence for killing a motorist who picked him up on the road. French was furious. He wanted a death sentence. He wrote to the judge multiple times demanding one, but the sentence went unchanged. So he took matters into his own hands, strangling his cellmate to death with a towel. On trial, he revealed his motive for killing his cellmate was to get the electric chair, and the state finally obliged. French went to the electric chair with a smile. When asked for his last words, he said, "Everything's already been said." What he meant was that he had already given his last words to journalist Bob Gregory for Oklahoma Monthly Magazine. You know what I'd say in the headline? French fries. See ya. Maybe no murderer's death has had as much impact as our number 3, Gary Gilmore. Gilmore was a criminal from the time he was 14, stealing cars with friends.
In April 1976, he arrived in Utah following his parole from Oregon jail, where he'd been serving time for armed robbery. He was as honest in Utah as he was in Oregon. In July, he robbed and shot to death a gas station employee, then repeated the crime the next night, this time against a motel manager. A garage mechanic spotted Gilmore getting rid of the weapon, a .22 caliber pistol, and notified police. Gilmore's cousin also called the police, and the killer was apprehended while trying to flee the city. Gilmore's timing was terrible. Just 1 month before his crimes, the United States reinstated the death penalty. He would be the first criminal executed in 4 years. Gilmore's impending fate inspired a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, an Emmy-winning television movie, as well as song spoofs performed on Saturday Night Live. Gilmore didn't care about any of it. When he arrived to meet his fate at the hands of the firing squad, his last words were, "Let's do it." Weirdly enough, ad man Dan Whedon admitted that Gilmore's last words inspired the slogan he came up with for Nike, "Just do it." Few killers get newspaper reviews of their last words, but that happened with our number 2, Charles Guiteau. Despite his rambling soapbox speeches being sparsely attended, Guiteau believed he was the deciding factor in James Garfield's 1880 presidential victory. When his repeated requests for ambassadorship were rebuffed, he felt betrayed. On July 2, 1881, Guiteau approached President Garfield from behind, shooting him twice in the back. He was charged with murder 11 weeks later when the president finally succumbed to his wounds. At his trial, Guiteau argued with the judge, the public, and even his own lawyers, and gave testimony in the form of long epic poems. A means of communication he continued up to his death. When asked for his final words, Guiteau recited an original composition, finishing with, "I wonder what I will see when I get to the Lordy. I expect to see most glorious things, beyond all earthly conception. When I am with the Lordy, glory hallelujah, glory hallelujah. I am with the Lord." Writers at the time called it pathetic and obvious imbecility. The number 1 most disturbing final words from a murderer have to be from Peter Curtin. At least 9 murders, 31 attempted murders, plus numerous mutilations and yes, blood drinking, earned him the nickname the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Curtin said his acts of violence excited him physically and emotionally. He sometimes told his victims that's what love is all about. Sentenced to the guillotine, his final words were consistent with that view. "After my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures. Good riddance."